The launch of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, was Germany's most desperate gamble of the Second World War. It was a gamble Hitler felt compelled to take if his ambition of the complete subjugation of Europe were to become a reality. 4/5 of Germany's total armies, 3 million troops, were committed to the most appalling conflict in the history of warfare. In little more than 1 year, Hitler's armies had reduced vast areas of Western Russia to dust and rubble, and subjected the Soviet peoples to unimaginable brutality. While the Allies looked on, Russia was in agony and being dragged through a nightmare of slaughter to the edge of extinction. In 1941, the conquest of Russia would not only have provided Germany with the agricultural and industrial supplies to ensure Hitler's mastery of Europe, it would have simultaneously rid him of the only military power capable of challenging his domination. The deaths of tens of millions of Russians was not simply an economic necessity. Their destruction would pave the way for the Großraum, a concept already under development by Heinrich Himmler as the culmination of Hitler's call for Lebensraum. The Großraum was envisaged as a gigantic Germanic state stretching from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the mountains of the Urals in the east. The Großraum would be ruled by the master race of Germans, served by the more acceptable of the subhumans within its borders, but eliminating those like the Slavs and the Jews, who were too unredeemably decadent to be allowed to survive. Once established, this superstate would provide Hitler with the ideal platform for his ultimate aim: complete domination of the world. His vision was of a world in which nationalism would cease to exist, replaced by a universal society of masters and slaves. Standing between Hitler and the realization of this vision were the armies of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a fighting force whose condition of unpreparedness paid tribute to the paranoia of its political leadership and the excesses of a state which vied with Germany in the extent of its totalitarian oppression.
The whole ideological thrust of the German plan for war, which was not just a nominal war of conquest, it was intended to be a war of extermination. It was intended first and foremost to root out what they called the Jewish Bolshevik gang who ran Russia. It was designed to destroy the political structure both of the Soviet Union and of the Red Army. So the degree of barbarization which set in at a very early stage in the Soviet-German War, the Great Patriotic War, was a feature which persisted until the very last day of that war.
While Hitler, having dealt with his political opponents during the Night of the Long Knives, was by the late 30s industriously nurturing the leadership of Germany's armed forces, Stalin was busily destroying Russia's. In 1936, Tukhachevsky, chief of staff of the Russian army, was executed for treason, following a trial which lasted only a single day. 6 of the 8 generals forming the court-martial which condemned him were themselves to follow suit soon after. By the end of the purge, the Russian army had lost 3 of the 5 remaining marshals of the Soviet Union, all 11 deputy ministers of defense, 75 of the 80 members of the military Soviet, all the commanders of the military districts, 13 of the 15 army commanders, more than half the corps commanders, and approximately 30% of the officers below brigade level. Stalin, however, controlled the balance of power in Europe. And when a German-Soviet non-aggression pact was announced in August 1939, the world was shocked. Cynically burying their ideological differences, Fascist Germany and Communist Russia agreed to take no military action against one another for the next 10 years. In a secret additional protocol, they also agreed to divide the independent states of Eastern Europe between them. The Soviet Union then threatened the Baltic states with invasion unless they allowed Soviet armies to be stationed within their borders. The Balts had little option but to comply. Rigged plebiscites gave a gloss of legitimacy to this invasion. Stalin now controlled eastern Poland and Galicia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Stalin's overall strategy was to create a barrier of Russian territory between the Soviet Union and Germany. Snug behind this defensive wall, he planned to allow the Allies to fight a mutually destructive war in the West. 1 year later, however, Stalin's hopes of a protracted war seem to have evaporated with the brilliant success of Hitler's blitzkrieg tactics. The failure of the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain only made the Soviet position more vulnerable. An invasion of Britain had been postponed indefinitely. It would still be 18 months to 2 years before Britain would be capable of mounting an attack on the mainland of Europe. The German submarine blockade of her shores and the relentless bombing of her war industries might delay such preparations even further. On the 18th of December 1940, Hitler's manic gaze turned firmly towards Russia. The first Barbarossa directive ominously stated that the USSR might be invaded even before the war with Great Britain was over.
What was built into Barbarossa was not just the German operational and military plans, but a huge deception scheme. And the aim of this deception scheme was actually very simple. It wasn't to introduce into Stalin's mind or the Russian mind uncertainty. It was to introduce certainty. And the certainty was as follows. And this is how the Russians proceeded. Yes, they knew there was going to be a German attack. The Germans produced various bits of information or leaked information. And that was certainly clear. Stalin was well aware that sooner or later the Germans would attack. There was also the assumption, very deftly introduced by the Germans, that in fact, before this attack, there could well be negotiations. There might even be, and the Russians now have disclosed this, there might even have been a personal meeting between Hitler and Stalin. There were two elements to this German position. One was that the massive German military buildup was in fact, if you like, not an inducement, but a form of coercion to force him into a negotiating position. And on June the 14th, he made this perfectly plain by the famous TASS statement saying, look, we know what you're up to. We know all about these concentrations, but there is nothing to prevent a settlement of Soviet-German relations. That was the first thing. The second thing was a certain element of self-deception on Stalin's side, to the effect that, one, he strongly believed that Hitler would never embark on a two-front war. It would be folly. Actually, what he didn't realize was Hitler was embarking on a one-front war because the war in the West, though not wound down, wasn't all that active. And the second thing was, again, Stalin's great concern, actually, and I think this went back to the First World War, that although the Soviet General Staff, Zhukov and Vasilievsky and others, and particularly Timoshenko, were urging Stalin to mobilize, Stalin argued, actually, and he shouted at Timoshenko, what do you want, a war? Because the act of mobilization, full formal mobilization, essentially would trigger war. And the final thing was, an important element of his strategy was not to provoke the Germans. And indeed, even on the morning of the 22nd of June 1941, when the German army is advancing, he's still partly persuaded of what he thought was a provocatia. He even imagined it was some breakaway German generals who were trying it on, as it were. This wasn't the real thing.
As the German build-up toward Operation Barbarossa continued, Stalin's attempts to pacify Hitler grew more desperate. He had already stated in an interview with Pravda in November 1939 that it was not Germany who had attacked Britain and France, but Britain and France who had attacked Germany. Stalin now forbade any criticism of Germany to be printed in the newspapers. When Hitler successfully invaded Greece and Yugoslavia, Stalin expelled the Yugoslavian ambassador to Moscow and refused a request to recognize the Greek government in exile. Stalin felt he was continuing to buy time by these unrequited concessions, but his use of the breathing space which he had already obtained was totally devoid of any worthwhile attempt to remedy his military disadvantages. By May 1940, 170 Soviet divisions were stationed in newly occupied territory, with the result that over half the army were occupying positions whose fortifications and rearward communications were incomplete. Indeed, by June, with a German attack imminent, Western Special Military District was a shambles. Many formations were between 6,000 to 7,000 men short of wartime establishment. Levies of experienced personnel had been hived off to build new tank and aviation units. Only one of 6 mechanized corps had received their full complement of equipment. 3 of the 4 motorized divisions had no tanks, and 4 out of every 5 vehicles in the tank fleets were obsolete. 4 of the corps had only 1/4 of their designated motor vehicles, and in another 4, 1 in 3 motor vehicles needed repairs. Therefore, although the opposing forces had amassed vast amounts of weaponry along their common borders, the Soviet Red Army and the German Wehrmacht were anything but equal adversaries.
The Red Army consisted of about 5 million men. That is in the western part of Russia, never mind those who are in the Far East. And the tank strength of the Red Army on the 21st of June 1941 was 23,108, of which you can argue possibly that 8,000 tanks were battle-ready and in good condition. On the German side, the German strength was roughly about 3.5 million men, possibly with their allies, the Finns, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, and so on. You can bring that up to, let us say, about 4 million. In terms of armor, the Germans were able to employ something like 3,300 tanks. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Indeed, numbers are extremely misleading. The interpretation has really got to be on A, the operational readiness of the armies, in which the Wehrmacht was clearly absolutely superior and ready to go, and was well prepared and briefed for its task. If you look at the Red Army, there were severe problems of manning, organization, training, logistics, supply. Even more important, the Germans were operating according to a plan. And indeed, the work I've done and many of my Russian colleagues showed this, that the Red Army was in an extraordinary position. There was no plan, in spite of what people say. The Red Army could neither defend nor attack.
The awesome German armies which the 170 understrength divisions of the Russian troops faced were divided into 3 large groups. These consisted of 148 fully manned and equipped divisions, of which 19 were Panzer and 15 Panzer Grenadier divisions. The Army Group South was commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and was charged with seizing Kiev and taking control of the Ukraine as far as the river Dnieper. Field Marshal von Bock's Army Group Center was to strike towards Smolensk. Army Group North, under Field Marshal von Lieb, was to attack through the Baltics and seize Leningrad. The 3 German army groups were supplemented by 500,000 Finnish troops advancing from their homeland in 14 divisions, and 150,000 Romanians attacking along the Black Sea toward Odessa. These forces, together with the Luftwaffe, which had devoted 80% of its operational strength, 2,770 aircraft, to the build-up for Barbarossa, fielded over 3,350 tanks, over 7,000 artillery pieces, 60,000 motor vehicles, and 625,000 horses. The Russian army still clung to its peacetime structure. Should war occur, then each military district would be transformed into army groupings similar in structure to the Germans. The North Soviet front was to repel advances through the Balkans and defend Leningrad from Finnish attack. The Northwest, West and Southwest fronts would engage the three main German army groups, and the Southern Front would deal with any advance toward Odessa. Behind these lines, the contrast between the warring nations could not have been greater. While Germany boasted one of the finest industrial infrastructures in the world, Russia had still not completed its industrial revolution. Stalin had declared in 1931 that one feature of the history of old Russia was the continual beatings that she suffered for falling behind, for her backwardness, for military backwardness, for agricultural backwardness. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or they crush us. By 1941, a generation of upheaval had left its mark economically and psychologically. Revolution and civil war had been followed by the destruction of the peasantry and their enforced collectivization. Whole segments of the population had been uprooted and transported to work the new industries set up in the mineral-rich regions of Siberia, the Urals, and Kazakhstan. The Russian people, deprived of news of the build-up on their borders, and subject to a media devoid of any mention of the increasingly anti-Soviet rhetoric of Hitler, were totally unprepared for the latest disaster which was about to descend on them. At 0400 hours on the 22nd of June 1941, the maelstrom which was Barbarossa finally erupted. The German armies of the Blitzkrieg sliced through the Russian forces on every front. Faced by the results of his intransigent refusal to act, Stalin panicked. While his army headquarters desperately tried to piece together the most rudimentary picture of what was happening, he ordered an immediate counteroffensive on all fronts. As the first reports of the devastation his own command had helped to create filtered through, he was shattered. All that Lenin created, we have lost forever, he declared. He finally retreated to his dacha, not to emerge until the 3rd of July.
That what stunned the Red Army commanders was that the German army proceeded without any artillery support. It simply sliced through. And what the Red Army command had expected was there would be a meeting engagements, you would have opening actions. That would develop over, let us say, something like 10 days. You would have large, complex frontier engagements, and then the real war would begin. When in 48 hours, in Army Group North, German panzer columns were actually approaching Riga. So this technique, if you like, of the Germans and the use of their armor in that respect came, as I say, as an extraordinary and totally disorganizing surprise, even to senior Russian commanders. And within 48 hours, if you read the Russian General Staff reports, it's perfectly plain they have totally lost control of the situation. The thing is chaos. They don't know where their troops are. They don't know what's happening. They don't have accurate reports of German movements. They're not quite sure where the German thrust is going to be. All that they did know, actually, was to the south, in Army Group South under Rundstedt. That was being slightly delayed. And there the Russians had a little more time to prepare. And if you compare the operational narrative there, yes, the Germans are somewhat held up, not for very long. But in the northwest and in the west, there's total collapse. And of course, the consequence was that Stalin operated his usual practice. He took out the front commanders and shot them.
At the front, the rapier thrusts of the German panzer divisions were skewering through the chaotic Russian defences. The panzer groups created deadly breaches in the Soviet line, slicing the Red Army forces into isolated segments. The supporting German divisions then moved forward in encircling advances, which surrounded these pockets of defenders. The ferocity and effectiveness of the panzer attacks was so great that some of the pockets were gigantic. Groups of up to 15 Russian divisions were surrounded and mercilessly pummeled into surrender. The encirclement of Minsk by the right flank of Army Group North and the left flank of Army Group Center yielded 300,000 prisoners, 2,500 tanks, and 1,400 artillery pieces. 32 of the 43 Russian divisions were gutted within a week, and the road to Moscow penetrated to a depth of 300 kilometers. The remainder of Army Group North scythed into the Baltics, capturing Riga, the Latvian capital. Only in the south were the German forces limited to shallow advances towards Lwów and Rouno. In the skies, the Soviet Air Force was faring worse than the land army, if that were possible. The mainly obsolete Russian fighters, 20 to 100 miles per hour slower than the Messerschmitt 109s, were constantly outfought. Many of them never got the opportunity of aerial combat. The Luftwaffe claimed to have destroyed 1,500 aircraft on the ground during the first day of Barbarossa. On the ground, chaos reigned. The Luftwaffe were pulverizing the road and rail links behind the Russian lines. Many officers were not even bothering to use code in their desperate pleas for instructions from their headquarters. Struggling masses of uncoordinated troops were being slaughtered by the German troops as they attempted to obey Stalin's orders to counterattack. Others were being machine-gunned by their own military police for fleeing from positions which were worse than hopeless.
The reality was that they were left leaderless. First of all, they really had no orders. Sometimes they had guns but no ammunition. Sometimes they had on many occasions, they had tanks but no fuel, or they had tanks which broke down, or they had orders which were contradictory. And there was the usual situation whereby the order simply was advance. What do you mean advance against crack German divisions? And many of the Red Army divisions simply broke up. And what you got were very large pockets of Red Army troops. For example, within a matter of 4 or 5 days, the Wehrmacht, the German army in the east, had managed to encircle 350,000 Red Army soldiers. 350,000. That was the first of the beginning, actually, of a number of huge encirclements.
By the 3rd of July, the battle for the frontier was over. The German armies had advanced along a line from the river Dvina in the north to the Dnieper in the south. General Holder, chief of German General Staff, declared that the war against the Soviet Union had taken only 14 days to win. But the German intelligence had totally underestimated the reserves which Russia could command. By July the 1st, 5,300,000 men had been mobilized. Stalin had emerged from his isolation to broadcast a message of patriotism and resistance to the nation. For once, the Russian people were told the truth. The pre-war complacency which Stalin had done so much to foster had now rapidly to be undone. In Leningrad, when news of war reached the factories, the general consensus was that it would be over within the week. Well, it won't necessarily be over in a week, one Russian worker was reported as saying. It will take them 3 or 4 weeks to get to Berlin. Stalin now took direct control of the Red Army. But the general mobilization of Russian troops failed to curtail the German advance. 4 reserve armies of 37 divisions were dispatched to bolster West Front in the general area of Smolensk. The Germans countered with yet another encirclement, and the panzer groups of Generals Hoth and Guderian smashed through the Soviet line and maneuvered 300,000 Russian troops into an indefensible pocket. Another 150,000 prisoners, 2,000 tanks and 2,000 artillery pieces fell into German hands. Goebbels announced that the eastern continent lies like a limp virgin in the mighty arms of the German Mars. Army Group South finally broke through the Russian southwest front, and another pocket yielded a further toll of 100,000 prisoners.
Now, the scale of these encirclements, 500,000 men, and by the last week in November, Red Army strength dropped to a level which was its lowest during the war because the Germans had taken 3.1 million prisoners. 3.1 million prisoners is an enormous number. Indeed, that was basically the pre-war Red Army destroyed. More than 30 divisions had been completely wiped out. What astonished the Germans, of course, was as these divisions were literally wiped out from the order of battle, more and more divisions took their place. And while the Germans were calculating on the fact that they thought they knew the Russian order of battle, what came as an astonishing and disturbing shock to them was that more and more divisions are coming into the line. Not always fully manned, but the Russian order of battle was in fact being steadily built up.
The devastating speed of the German advance was due to the power and tactical brilliance of its panzer divisions. The concept of an integrated armour force had intrigued the German military since the close of the First World War. By the early 30s, 10 prototype tanks had been designed and built in secret. Ironically, the initial development of what would become the most technically accomplished and cost-effective tank program ever seen took place at the German-Soviet tank school at Kazan in Russia. At the outbreak of war in the East, the backbone of the Panzer Corps was the Panzer Mark IV. Designed by Krupp and weighing 17.3 tons, the Panzer Kampfwagen IV carried a crew of 5 at a maximum speed of 18.5 miles per hour. Its armour varied in thickness from 8 to 30 centimetres, and it was armed with a 75mm turret gun and 2 machine guns. Supported by the lighter Mark III, which was similar in size and appearance, the Mark IV swept all before it, until the Russian T-34 tank made its appearance in numbers.
What the Russians had tried to do in between 1940 and 45 was to bring in 2 new tanks, the T-34, which actually was the tank which had been tested in 39, and the rather heavier tank, the Klim-Voroshilov. But they'd only produced about 1,000 of each. So therefore, these T-34s were distributed in very small packets. And remember, the battlefront is about 2,000 miles long. So what do you do with 1,000 tanks? On the other hand, it did come as an enormous shock the first time that the Germans encountered the T-34, because the T-34's armor, mobility, speed, and gunpowder was something they simply hadn't suspected. And Guderian, as you will remember, actually, in November 1941, ran into a T-34 ambush and was completely destroyed.
Russian armoured warfare was inhibited by Stalin's disenchantment with tank divisions, which had led him in the 30s to utilize his armour only in the support of infantry formations. After witnessing German successes on the Western Front, Stalin changed his mind. But the reorganization of Russian armour was not completed before the launch of Barbarossa. Even though Russian tanks outnumbered German 2-1 at the front and 6-1 overall, tactical ineffectiveness, obsolete models and widespread disrepair tipped the advantage overwhelmingly in favour of Germany during the first stages of the conflict.
But it wasn't just the quality of the German tank, it was the capability of the panzer commanders to do with their armour what was essential. That is, they had excellent command and control facilities. At that time, they had very good support logistical facilities. And indeed, essentially, they knew what they were doing. So that although German Mark II Tactics IIIs might run up against a huge elephantine Klim-Voroshilov tank, the KV-1, the big heavy tank, and German shells might bounce off them, nonetheless, such was the, I must say, the haphazard and untrained manner in which the Russians handled their armour anyway, that the Germans soon made short meat of them.
After a month of victorious progress, the German High Command were disconcerted by the rapidity of their own advance. Their armies were now fighting on a front 1,000 miles wide. The Stukas could no longer deliver the concerted hammer blows which had punched the holes in the Russian lines, which the panzers had so mercilessly exploited. Even though the Soviet Air Force had by now lost approximately 5,000 aircraft, the supply of replacements seemed endless. The factories in the east, which were churning out more effective fighter models, were out of Luftwaffe bombing range. The German air assault began to run low on fighters. The Luftwaffe also had serious supply problems. The distance from home base and the destruction of the transport infrastructure meant that aircraft replacement parts had to be flown to forward airfields. The lengthening supply lines were also affecting the German ground forces. Tank commanders, hundreds of miles from their Polish depots, nevertheless pressed for the final thrust toward Moscow. They argued that only the continuation of the offensive would prevent the Russians from organizing a fresh line of resistance. While many of Hitler's generals disagreed that such an attack should be launched immediately, they were almost unanimous in recommending that Moscow should become the primary objective of the next phase of the war. Hitler, on the other hand, was worried about the possibility of the gaps between the panzer divisions and the main armies being exploited by Russian reinforcements. He also feared that the hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops left behind the German lines in the wake of the advance might coordinate their actions into an effective guerrilla movement. According to the account of one witness to the disarray behind the German advance, he need hardly have worried. One Russian soldier reported, "Thousands of mobilized men from various places which have already been captured and from near the frontline zone roam from place to place. They lack any purpose, any sense of order. They have no uniforms. 20% are barefoot. The leaders are leaving, and they are abandoning us to ruin." Hitler had never been fully convinced of the importance of Moscow and continued to regard it as a secondary objective. The debate stretched out until mid-August. A vital month of summer weather was wasted. The Russians had the breathing space to throw reserve divisions into the gaps in their defences. Barely trained, poorly equipped, some in the battered remnants of their civilian clothing, their stubborn ferocity meant that they were still a force to be reckoned with.
A rapid campaign to crush Russia should have been over by August, wasn't. They had to think again, and the first thing, of course, that they had to think about were logistics and supply. No great preparation had been made for a winter campaign in Russia. The second thing was that the German High Command and German intelligence and the German military as a whole had vastly underestimated the ability of the Red Army to resist. Their aim was to destroy the Red Army west of the Dnieper, but they hadn't done it. Whatever they did to the Red Army, and they battered it mercilessly, they didn't destroy it. It was still basically there at the end of December. And when you compare both the Red Army and the German army at that time, you will see the Germans pushing their very last battalion down to the line. And the Red Army on the other side is desperately trying to push its final and important reserves into position as well. So it was two armies which were desperately stretched. But in terms of, if you like, survivability, in terms of responsiveness, the Red Army just had the edge. Only just, but they had that vital and important edge.
Eventually, the generals were silenced, and two major objectives were prioritized: the capture of Leningrad and the fall of the Ukraine. A giant pincer movement involving half of Army Group Center and the left flank of Army Group South began to close its jaws on a huge pocket of Russian forces to the rear of Kiev. Field Marshal Zhukov, the Soviet Chief of Staff, pleaded with Stalin for a strategic withdrawal of the troops defending the city. He was dismissed from his post. Marshal Timoshenko, the newly appointed Southwest commander, arrived just in time to see the trapped Soviet divisions. The 600,000 prisoners taken by the Germans remain the highest number ever captured in a single engagement. The battle for the Ukraine now centered on the Crimean Peninsula, where the right flank of Army Group South pressed the Soviet 51st Army back towards Sebastopol. While half of the German Group Center were engaged in subduing the Ukraine, Marshal Zhukov, transferred to the reserve forces behind West Front, seized the opportunity to attack the German Fourth Army. Occupying a salient near Smolensk, the Germans were now themselves vulnerable to encirclement. The Fourth Army were thrown back 12 kilometers, but, without sufficient tanks and aircraft, Zhukov failed to tighten the noose he had made. However, in terms of morale, Zhukov's counterthrust was highly significant. His action was the first substantial Soviet counterattack of the war. Hitler's response was to regroup Army Group Center and prepare the most critical operation of the campaign. Operation Typhoon, the drive towards Moscow, was finally underway. 70 divisions, spearheaded by 1,500 tanks, would race toward the Russian capital before the rains of autumn or the snows of winter could halt their progress. On September the 30th, General Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group almost inevitably broke through the Soviet line and had encircled the defending Bryansk front by the 6th of October. Simultaneously, the Western Front, commanded by Marshal Timoshenko, fell into a similar trap. The pockets of Vyazma and Bryansk, containing 9 armies of 71 divisions, were almost completely destroyed. Another 660,000 troops faced the grim hospitality that the German army meted out to prisoners of war, and the road to Moscow lay open. In the Baltics, by the 16th of August, von Lieb's Army Group North had captured the city of Novgorod, a vital target in the approach to Leningrad. The beleaguered defenders had fought to the death, following the German discovery of the city's defensive plans on the corpse of a Soviet officer. General Hauptner's 4th Panzer Group resumed its drive towards Leningrad, but without supporting infantry, its progress was limited. Leningrad was a vital center of the wartime production industry, and reserves and equipment were poured into the defense of the city. The citizens themselves formed into militia, divisions which were flung against the Germans more in despair than hope. Following a basic training period, averaging 16 hours, the 1st Militia Division was sent to the front 6 days after being formed, the 2nd 2 days, and the 3rd the same day it was established.
there certainly was a surge of patriotism, but there was also, as the war went on, a deepening vengeful feeling, a feeling of revenge. And there was also a sense, and I think whatever artificiality there may be about it, it is true, there was a sense of the kind of morality of this. This is something you had to do. Well, why otherwise did you get kids of 14 working 12, 14 hours a day in ammunition plants? Why did you get a lot of these extraordinary sacrifices on the part of ordinary people who didn't have to do it? And yet under a really ferocious Soviet system which either abandoned the population or brutally coerced them. I mean, they were caught between two fires. I do remember talking to one senior Soviet officer and asking him what really happened in terms of a choice. He said, we were faced with a choice between two dictators, Hitler on the one hand and Stalin on the other, but we preferred to pick the one who spoke Russian.
Despite such gargantuan efforts, the first shells began to pour down on Leningrad early in September. With the arrival of the 18th Army to reinforce the panzers on the 8th, the German stranglehold on the city tightened further. The capture of Schlüsselburg to the east signaled the end of rail transport. When Marshal Zhukov arrived to take over the defense of the city on the 10th of September, he found the defenders in an advanced state of disorganization and the inhabitants close to panic. Undaunted, he briskly set about bolstering its defences. A shortage of anti-tank guns was dealt with by converting anti-aircraft artillery to the task of attempting to halt the panzers. 6 brigades of naval infantry and students were formed, and reinforcements drafted in from the Karelian Isthmus. Zhukov began to take the fight to the Germans through raids and counterattacks. But by now the German troops had pierced the inner circle of defences and were rampaging through the suburbs. After a furious exchange of advances and retreats, at the end of the month, the defenders were still hanging onto their city by their fingernails. It seemed inevitable that Leningrad would capitulate. But as Zhukov awaited a renewed assault, the 4th Panzer Group suddenly departed to join the battle for Moscow, and the remaining German forces began to build defences. Leningrad would not now be taken by force. It would be starved into submission.
All normal rules of warfare, insofar as they apply, were abandoned. And this applied on both sides. For example, as the Soviet partisan movement grew up, then the war became very savage. But I have asked many, many Russians, whom I know very well, really, what really happened? I mean, why did the war change? And basically their explanation was this, both soldiers and civilians, and indeed many of my contemporaries. They said in the first 3 months of the war, that's from June until December, it seemed to be a war like anything else. They realized something terrible had happened. And they heard the Soviet government's statements about German atrocities, but they didn't really believe them. But when the survivors came back into Soviet territory and told the real truth about what was happening, I mean the ghastliness of this, then it suddenly dawned on the Russians that something quite unbelievably terrible had happened. And then you get a change in Russian propaganda, not just government propaganda, not just Stalin on the July the 3rd, 1941, beginning his broadcast, brothers and sisters, and half the Soviet population nearly fainted, I mean, coming from Stalin. Then you get propaganda about kill. You get propaganda about destroy the Germans. You get propaganda about really the full ferocity of this kind of thing on a purely personal basis. It is your responsibility. I mean, I've talked to women soldiers in the Red Army who were tank commanders, who served in artillery battalions, and you ask them, why did you go? Why were you there? Why were you handling 100-pound shells, manning anti-aircraft guns? Because they said, my mother and father said you should go.
The German invaders controlled all of Western Russia on a line from Leningrad in the north to Rostov on the Black Sea, and the Red Army was still retreating before them. The countryside they left behind was a wasteland. The first few months of the war had robbed the nation of nearly 50% of her grain-producing lands. Where the armies had fallen back, vast tracts of crops lay ruined in the fields. The rotting carcasses of livestock, slaughtered to deprive the Germans of food, mingled their stench with the corpses of soldiers and peasants. Villages, tumbled into ruins, became the silent memorials of their former inhabitants. The mangled wreckage of sabotaged industries smouldered beneath the skies. Amid the ruin, thousands of starving, orphaned children searched vainly for their parents. But the fighting spirit of the Russians was far from crushed. It had been inflamed by accounts of the slaughter of prisoners of war and the murder and torture committed by the German invaders. Even the constant series of military reverses failed to dampen the ardor of defenders whose motherland had been ravaged.
Their system wasn't perfect. It had sacrificed millions of men. It wasn't all that efficient, but when it was all boiled down, what are they left with? I mean, this barbarous, murderous, genocidal regime which exploited the country, and even more actually, and this is a point which has never much been explored, but which actually humiliated the Russians, denigrated them as a people. And this coming from the Germans, whom they'd always respected as Beethoven, Goethe, Heine. What kind of people were these? It wasn't just the SS. It was the whole German impress of this, which I think shocked the Russians tremendously. It's also a shock from which I think they haven't recovered even to this day.
Who could have foreseen that the siege of Leningrad was not the final stage of a bitter struggle that would bring Hitler domination over the Soviets and Europe? Only in later years could it be recognized as the first move in a conflict of inhumane savagery that had brought Russia to the edge of annihilation, but which eventually led to one of Hitler's greatest failures, the total collapse of the Großraum. By the 14th of October 1941, the forces of Operation Typhoon, Hitler's plan to capture Moscow, had struggled through a week of torrential rain and tenacious Russian resistance. The roads had disintegrated into canals of bottomless mud, along which wheeled vehicles could drive only at a snail's pace and only if they were towed by tanks. Despite the conditions, the Germans had advanced to within 100 kilometers of the Russian capital. The Russians had passionately defended every inch of their motherland, with little regard for their own lives. Their suffering had been intense, but there was still more and worse to come. Less than 1 year later, they were to be engulfed in a massive German onslaught as Hitler's campaign in Russia reached its bitter zenith at Stalingrad. In Moscow, the nerve center of the Soviet Union, the proximity of the German armies threw the inhabitants into total disarray. Mass evacuations were organized, while some citizens simply fled of their own accord. Even Stalin and his government prepared to abandon their capital.
There are lots of rumors about Stalin and Moscow. But Stalin, for all his faults actually, and from what one can gather from talking to some of his closest aides, he had no intention of leaving Moscow and made that quite plain. And he asked Zhukov actually, in the middle of October actually, when there was a huge panic in Moscow, and Moscow virtually evacuated itself. It's called in Russian Bolshoi Drap, the big skedaddle. This was an unauthorized evacuation. And Stalin, although the city had been mined and everything was ready to be blown up, Stalin said to Zhukov, "Can we hold Moscow?" And Zhukov said, "Yes, we can." Stalin said, "Right, that's it." And He remained in Moscow, and he was there, genuinely there. It was very important he was there on the 7th of November 1941. I mean, he was physically there. He made the broadcast. I mean, it was perfectly apparent that Stalin was there, and Stalin was there to stay.
The remaining citizens of Moscow were scoured for recruits to a civil reserve force, which was hastily mobilized to the front. Stalin now learned from his spies in Japan that the Japanese government did not intend to attack in the east. Freed of the nightmare of war on a second front, he ordered the transport of 22 fresh divisions of well-equipped Siberian forces to Moscow. The November frosts came late but sharp. General Guderian had earlier requested winter supplies, but had been rebuked for negative thinking. The Germans began to find a concrete use for the propaganda leaflets they had been issued with, stuffing them into their uniforms to keep the cold at bay. In Moscow, Stalin struggled to kindle the flame of citizen morale by staging the traditional Revolution Day parade despite the dangers of aerial bombardment. In his speech at Lenin's tomb, he again appealed to the ancient Russian tradition of heroism in the face of adversity. The war you are waging is a war of liberation, a just war. May you be inspired in this war by the heroic figures of our great ancestors. Hitler had insisted that his armies should divide and approach Moscow from the north and south simultaneously. By the end of November, they were only 30 kilometers from their target. The spires of the Kremlin were tantalizingly within their gaze. But Hitler's arrogance in failing to provide winter supplies was now disastrously limiting their progress. Without antifreeze, motor vehicles would not start, and planes could not fly. In a final assault, which had begun on the 1st of December, the Germans came as close as 15 kilometers to Moscow. Zhukov's western front then began to drive back the northern arm of their encirclement, and southern front halted Guderian's forces around Tula to the south. Mobile groups of Russians destroyed fuel dumps and artillery deep behind the German lines. The troops of the Third Reich now faced fully equipped Russian infantry, snugly clad in their felt boots and greatcoats. Harried by ski battalions, they watched their enemies' T-34 tanks crash through snow and woodland, while their own panzers sluggishly negotiated the roadways. German morale wilted. The hard-pressed soldiers, most of them still clad in their summer uniforms and tight leather boots, fell back rapidly, often abandoning huge caches of equipment in their haste. Encouraged by their breakthrough, the Russian High Command attempted to turn the German tactics on themselves and encircle their entire army group center. Despite Hitler's orders to stand firm, by the end of the year, the Germans had withdrawn up to 150 kilometers from Moscow. Generals Guderian and Höppner had been dismissed for retreating without permission.
The Red Army line was shortening, and Zhukov and Rokossovsky were, by moving up the reserve front, were beginning to be able, I think, to have a more coherent defense. Although it wasn't all that powerful, at least it began to react. And the Germans, in a sense, it literally, that phase of the offense ran into the ground. And then, as you remember, the Germans had to, in a sense, catch their breath again and make a second and final lunge, as it were.
The Russian counterattack was further strengthened by the reinstatement of officers condemned to the prison camps during Stalin's Great Purges. They were ferocious warriors. As the wounded commander of the 222nd Rifles told his German interrogators, "If a man has a penal camp behind him, death holds no terror for him." Less distinguished prisoners were released into penal battalions, which performed the most dangerous tasks such as clearing minefields and storming strongpoints. The casualty rate in these battalions was the highest in the Red Army, but prisoners still volunteered for military service. The death rate in the camps had increased sevenfold since 1940.
This was when Stalin sounded the most alarming and warning note. This was when he issued the order, not one step backwards, and he meant not one step backwards. He imposed, for example, penal battalions on the Red Army, anybody moving out of line. And if you look at the fact, for example, that perhaps some 400,000 Russian soldiers were put in penal battalions in the war, show you the scope and the scale of discipline. At the Battle of Stalingrad, 13,500 men in the Red Army were put in penal battalions and very probably shot.
At Leningrad, food supplies to the besieged city had been worsening throughout the autumn. By late November, they were at their lowest ebb of the whole siege. Manual workers were receiving only 250 grams of bread per day, 1/3 of their normal requirement. Without water for sanitation and basic medical supplies, disease became rampant. As temperatures fell to the -20s, thousands began to die each day. Total starvation threatened constantly. To the Germans, collapse seemed imminent. Back in Berlin, a reception with Adolf Hitler as guest of honor was organized to celebrate the fall of the stricken city. The invitations were printed, but never posted.
A very interesting picture you get is to talk to women soldiers in the Red Army, who were in combat units, by the way. And if you talk to the medical sisters, actually, they were up with sections and platoons fighting hand-to-hand with the Germans. And there you get a really, perhaps a more vivid picture of the kind of life that was led. With women trying to, sometimes these women medics had to pick up a machine pistol and deal with the Germans themselves. So you got women and those reminiscences and recollections of that kind of fighting is absolutely ghastly. Or of women who were at Stalingrad trying there. And seeing, for example, there's one terrible scene a lady was telling me about, on an ice floe floating down the Volga. Here were two groups of German and Russian soldiers dead, frozen into immobility. I mean, the ferocity and the inhumanity of the conflict beggars the imagination.
The Russians marked a road across the frozen southwest corner of Lake Lagoda, and by the 22nd of November, convoys of lorries were barely staving off famine in the city. It was a hazardous passage through the biting northeastern gales which swept across the lake. Yet, for all its horror, the Russians knew that defending this lifeline to the city was the only possibility of keeping the inhabitants alive. But the food coming across the ice was too little, too late for some. Victims of starvation, suffering from falling blood pressure and the wasting of the heart and internal organs, would never regain their health. Many would die months after food and medical supplies finally arrived. The children who survived would emerge totally traumatized by the siege. It was reflected in the way many of the children played all by themselves, in the way that even in their collective games they played in silence with grave faces. I saw faces of children which reflected such thoughtfulness and sorrow that those eyes and faces told one more than could be gathered from all the stories of the horrors of famine. As the new year approached, There was every reason for Stalin to feel optimistic about the outcome of the war. The German blitzkrieg had slowed to a crawl, halted, and was now grinding into reverse. It also seemed that the great exodus of industry to the east had been successfully accomplished.
They had managed to move out considerable elements of tank factories and aircraft factories. It wasn't so much a question of the proportion, it was a question of which particular plants. For example, the Kharkov tractor works, which produced tanks, was very. They managed to get that out. The workers in that factory walked along the railway line, by the way, under German gunfire to get in the trains to be moved out. They got the equipment out and they took the workers out. So what happened, of course, was in 1942, as the Wehrmacht bit deeper into Russia, then there had to be a second wave of evacuation. But by 1943, towards the end of autumn, they're beginning to move. There's a re-evacuation. So it was it was the largest industrial migration in the history of the world. Well over, I think it's about 1,900 plants were moved eastwards, and then, even without infrastructure there, factories were put on the bare ground, and in one aircraft factory, within, I think it was about 17 days of being relocated, they were producing their first aircraft.
While the next 3 months would prove critical, the economic war had been put on a sound footing. Before November, the Soviet Union had lost between 1/2 and 2/3 of its productive capacity in coal, pig iron, steel and aluminium, along with 1/4 of its engineering capacity. Its total industrial output had been halved. The eastern industrial enclaves rapidly became the cornerstone of the Russian war effort. The instant expansion of the Ural, Siberian and Kazakhstan centers of production in the first year of the war was nothing short of miraculous. The conditions of work were horrendous. Many of the evacuated workers were laboring in sub-zero temperatures while the factories were still being constructed around them. They slept on the floors beside their machines, or in crude dugouts next to the factories. Food was scarce and medical resources virtually non-existent. In the first phase of the relocation, output per head was poor, and the mortality rate among the workers was high. By the summer of 1942, output had begun to climb. As conditions improved, the production levels rose until the contribution of these areas reached 2.5 times the production of the entire pre-war Soviet economy. On land, the T-34 tank was now becoming standard, to the dismay of the German panzer groups. When the first of these medium tanks was met by the 17th Panzers, they found that their shells simply bounced off its heavy, sloped armor, while its high-velocity 76mm turret gun proved devastating. It ploughed through the advancing Germans for 9 miles before being halted by a field artillery howitzer at short range. Its powerful diesel engine enabled it to sail over terrain that the panzers totally balked at. But despite Soviet optimism, the war was far from nearing its end. The Russian defenders had paid a terrible price for their resistance, and the toll in human terms would continue for the next 3 years.
If you talk to the Russians, they will say, and they will tell you, and many will tell you, that 1942 was a worse year than 1941. Because 2 things happened. Stalin had a rush of blood to the brain and decided on premature offensive operations in the late winter, if you like, and early spring of 1942. And what happened as a result of that, you had perhaps the greatest disaster which befell the Red Army in the summer of 1942, when, in the German drive to the south into the Caucasus and further east, the Red Army really was nearly destroyed. But what happened there mystified Hitler, because instead of the great big encirclement operations of 41, the Red Army wasn't there. It had actually begun sensibly to retreat.
The Soviet casualties in the first 6 months of the invasion had been staggering. It was only 50 years later that it would be admitted that 1.5 million troops had perished in the defense of Moscow alone. Many of those who were taken prisoner by the Germans fared worse than the dead. The German High Command alleged that the Russians had refused to abide by the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war and encouraged German troops to seek revenge on such barbarous subhumans. The Soviet Union had in fact undertaken to observe the Geneva Protocols, and through neutral Sweden had requested that Germany do the same. Germany's response was to shoot Russian prisoners out of hand, to gas them, starve them, and deprive them of the medical supplies necessary for their survival. Many were crammed into rail carts and left in sidings to perish. Others were force-marched until they died from exhaustion. More were simply exposed to the deadly cruelties of the Russian winter. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners had been murdered by 1942, and this was to set an horrendous trend which would continue throughout the course of the war.
The Germans made no provision for their prisoners of war. They were left in the open, they were starved, they were beaten, they were shot, they were used. As a matter of fact, the German army very frequently used the bodies of Russian prisoners as emergency bridging equipment, to try. So the degree of barbarization which set in at a very early stage in the Soviet-German War, the Great Patriotic War, was a feature which persisted until the very last day of that war. And it was deliberate, and it was organized, it was systematic. And although the German army has tried to make excuses for itself, saying it had no part of it, this is simply not true. Indeed, if you look at Manstein's early orders in 1941, he is as enthusiastic for this barbaric policy as was anybody else. So it simply wasn't the Einsatzgruppen or the SS who did it. The German soldier finally was relieved of all sense of criminal responsibility under German military law. He was, from that point of view, an unbridled and unchecked agent. And don't worry, he took full advantage of it.
The total number of Russian prisoners to be captured would eventually be reckoned at 5.5 million. Hermann Goering told Ciano, Mussolini's envoy, that Russian prisoners, having been forced to eat the soles of their own boots, had then resorted to cannibalism, and had also eaten a German sentry. Some nations, he continued, must be decimated. There is nothing to be done about it. The paltry figure of 3.5 million slaughtered Russian POWs was a drop in the ocean for Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. Himmler's plans for the new order in Europe envisaged the reduction of its Slav population by at least 30 million. And it was Himmler and his deputy Heydrich who were the real masters of occupied Russia. Field Marshal Keitel, when asked why the supposedly civilized commanders of the German army allowed the barbarities of the Russian invasion to occur, protested that even the commander-in-chief of the army did not have the executive power or authority to issue and enforce laws in the occupied East. This prerogative belonged strictly to Heydrich and Himmler, who had, de facto, discretionary powers over the life and death of population and prisoners, including prisoners of war. Himmler's sinister executioners, the Schutzstaffen, or SS, became the supreme rulers of Western Russia. Even before Barbarossa, the SS had discussed with the army officers how they could be facilitated in the campaign of terror they were to unleash in the wake of the invasion. In May 1941, 4 Einsatzgruppen were formed, with the primary aim of eliminating the ideological opponents of the Reich. Soviet officials, commissars and Jews were to be rounded up and shot to death. In the event, those who were dispatched swiftly by a bullet were the fortunate. Local Jewish leaders in Russia were forced to assemble their people in designated areas. From these collection points, they were transported to killing fields, where they were stripped of their clothing and riddled with machine gun fire. The sheer numbers involved often meant that the wounded were also tipped into the burial pits and covered up to suffocate. At Kiev in September 1941, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in a single operation which lasted 2 days. In Pinsk, the carnage was accomplished with the use of grenades, dogs, axes, and the cavalry of the SS. It was difficult, demanding work, and soldiers were rewarded with treble pay and long holidays. Erich Ohlendorf, one of the Einsatzgruppen commanders, boasted that he had personally disposed of 90,000 victims, mainly Jews, in the first year of the war. But it was not only Jews who suffered. Anyone could be accused of being an official or a commissar and summarily executed. German troops were actively encouraged to commit outrage on an occupied population which was to be subjugated by terror. People were brutalized for real or imagined offenses, despite regulations, and women were raped in the streets in full view of horrified onlookers. As well as carrying out this policy of repression and ethnic sanitation, officials in Russia were also obliged to provide forced labor for the German war economy. This allowed male civilians in the Reich to be freed for military service. The German officials in Russia went about the task with an eerie mixture of barbarity and incompetence. Potential recruits were gathered without any discrimination as to their suitability. They were often left unfed for long periods, and conditions on the westbound freight trains which carried them were insanitary and inhuman. Babies born on the journey were ripped out of their mothers' arms and flung onto passing embankments to perish. Not surprisingly, by the end of 1941, 100,000 of those transported from the Ukraine were sent back as unfit to work. Many did not survive the return journey. Those waiting to travel westwards were forced to watch the dead comrades being unloaded from the trains they themselves would have to occupy. This treatment of occupied peoples, some of which had welcomed the Nazis as saviors from the tyranny of Stalin, eventually gave rise to resistance movements determined to exact revenge for the brutalities which had been inflicted on them. The atrocities were etched deep into the psyches of those who witnessed them and inspired an implacable hatred for the perpetrators. Hitler was rapidly losing faith in the commanders who had failed to bring Barbarossa to a successful conclusion. He had already dismissed both the cautious von Rundstedt and the audacious Guderian. The friction between Hitler and his generals became vocal and more rancorous as the winter wore on. Despite this, as the January initiative became bogged down in the spring thaw, Stalin had little to show for an offensive which was so ruthlessly driven that it produced more Russian than German casualties. The Volkov front managed to penetrate von Lieb's army group north, but its second shock army were isolated at the spearhead of the penetration, and the attack was repulsed. Further south, Northwest Front encircled 90,000 men of von Lieb's army in an 800-square-mile area near Diensk. However, in an heroic operation, which won the personal praise of the Führer, the Luftwaffe managed to stave off a withdrawal by providing the Diensk pocket with 270 tons of supplies each day, until eventually a corridor was pushed through to relieve the defenders. The 29th Army of the Kalanin Front, which had almost completed an encirclement of a large portion of Army Group Center, was itself surrounded and destroyed. Army Group South managed to contain the bulge that was developing under attack from the Russian South and Southwest fronts. In the Crimea, Russian gains were restricted to the Kursk Peninsula. It had been the most brutal winter in living memory, and both sides emerged exhausted, although the German armies should have been well prepared for the terrible conditions. Army General Meretskov wrote, "I will never forget the endless forests, the bogs, the waterlogged peat fields, the potholed roads, the punishing battle with the forces of the enemy that went on side by side with the equally punishing battle with the forces of nature." The German armies emerged from the winter fighting in a state described by General Franz Halder, Hitler's chief of staff, as disastrous. Of the 162 divisions facing the Red Army, only 11 were fully capable of offensive operations. For the 16 panzer divisions in the east, only 140 serviceable tanks were available, and most divisions were only 20% mobile. Nevertheless, Hitler was determined that a full-scale attack should be resumed. It was a question of advance or retreat.
The Wehrmacht wasn't entirely an armored army. Of course, it had large and important components of infantry. What people forget, actually, is that while the tanks are streaking across the Russian plain, the German infantry is marching. It conducted incredible infantry marches. You know, the infantry did the marching, by the way, to cover the ground. And so you've got a proportion, I think, out of about 160 German, 68 divisions, of which 19 are panzer divisions, some of them certainly spread out, as it were. So the impression that the Soviet-German war was a series of dramatic, high-speed, armored lunges and advances. If you look closely at the Soviet-German war, it's rather different, actually. One, and this is very often ignored, it was really a war of great sieges. Leningrad, Odessa, Sevastopol, Moscow. And then that was reversed as the Red Army advanced. The sieges are then on the German side. And the second thing was, if you look at the operations on the central part of the Soviet-German front, it was very importantly a struggle for control of the railway lines, because this facilitated a logistical movement. And when the Germans were deprived of much of their rail communications, they were in serious trouble. One of the great successes of the Red Army, by the way, was it didn't wait to capture huge stretches of a railway line. They would simply advance a short distance and build a railway line.
Halder even considered recommending a withdrawal to the pre-war border in Poland. Quite wisely, he never mentioned this to Hitler. If the German armies stepped back, then Russia could regroup her forces, recover her raw materials, and rebuild her Western industries. Hitler had been informed by the economic lobby in Germany that without fresh oil reserves, it could not sustain the war effort. The oil fields of the Caucasus beckoned temptingly. All thoughts of withdrawal were pushed aside. The losses of manpower, vehicles and tanks which had been suffered since the outbreak of hostilities could not be fully made good for the new offensive. Infantry divisions were now to total 7 battalions instead of 9. The battle strength of companies was reduced from 180 troops to 80. Between November 1941 and March 1942, only 7,500 vehicles were supplied to replace the 75,000 which had been lost, and fuel oil was in short supply. Mobility had been seriously affected. The panzer divisions which would take part in the summer offensive in the south contained barely 135 tanks each. Even this had only been achieved by seriously weakening northern and central divisions. The one weapon that Hitler did have on his side was surprise. Stalin had assumed that Hitler would resume his attack on Moscow and heavily reinforced its defensive reserves. But when the Germans struck on the 8th of May, it was the Crimean front which was torn apart by von Manstein's 11th Army. The German strategy was to clear its flanks for a concerted drive towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. While von Manstein subdued the Crimea, Timoshenko's southwest front, which lay on the northern flank of the drive, was to be destroyed by the 9th and 57th Armies. When the German encirclement was completed, almost the total reserve of T-34 and KV-1 tanks, built up over the winter months, was in German hands, along with over 2,000 guns and almost 250,000 prisoners. In the south, von Manstein had by now entered the final phase of his Crimean campaign, and only the fortress of Sebastopol, besieged since the previous year, was still under Soviet control. After 250 days of dogged resistance, Sebastopol finally capitulated on the 4th of July. The victorious troops were ordered north to Leningrad despite pleas to cross the Kerch Strait and bolster the main offensive. The German forces were now organized into 2 groups. Army Group B struck eastwards from Kursk to the north and Kharkov to the south, but failed to encircle the retreating Soviet forces. Hitler, convinced that the main body of the Red Army had retreated to the area north of Rostov, ordered a huge encirclement of the city. In doing so, he pulled the 4th Panzer Army away from its advance down the Donetsk corridor towards Stalingrad. It was a fatal mistake. Von Kleist was to write later, "The 4th Panzer Army was advancing on my left. It could have taken Stalingrad without a fight at the end of July, but was diverted south to help me in crossing the Don. I did not need its aid. It merely congested the roads I was using. When it turned north again, a fortnight later, the Russians had gathered just sufficient forces at Stalingrad to check it." After taking Rostov, Army Group A continued along the Black Sea coast toward the foothills of the Caucasus. Hitler had planned to take Stalingrad and then proceed southwards. He was now committed to achieving both objectives simultaneously. By late August, Army Group A was running into stiff resistance from the newly formed Trans-Caucasus Front, defending the span of the huge mountain chain from the Black Sea to the Caspian. A Russian southeast front was also established to protect the plains to the northeast of the mountains. The Caucasus front contained Georgians, Armenians and Azerians who were well aware of what a German invasion would mean for themselves and their families. Their resistance was desperate and determined. Approximately half the adult males of Georgia would eventually sacrifice themselves in the bitter struggle for their homeland. Not only was resistance hardening in front of Army Group A, but their strength was constantly being eroded to bolster the battle for Stalingrad to the north. The Caucasian oil wells had been the primary target of the German summer offensive. The taking of Stalingrad was at first simply an obvious target to protect the left flank of Army Group A. Had Stalingrad not been named in honor of the Russian leader, it might have remained a subsidiary target.
Stalingrad became, if you like, a symbol of German endurance, of German capability. It also had important strategic significance, by the way, because if they'd cut across the Volga, they sliced right through the Russian lines of communication for oil, for transport. So it wasn't a facile thing. But it became invested with enormous psychological significance. Both sides really in this ghastly chest-to-chest struggle from which they couldn't be unlocked, from which no one could see how they could be unlocked, except one had to be destroyed and the other become victor. And it had the quality of that kind of struggle. So the political importance which attached to Stalingrad was immensely important. And it worked once the Red Army mounted its counteroffensive and was successful. Of course, that worked to the advantage of the Soviet Union.
Hitler began to find the symbolism of its name increasingly difficult to resist. On the 23rd of July, its capture was placed on a par with the southern advance. By September, defeat at the city named after his arch-rival was unthinkable. Stalin too was aware of the symbolic significance involved. As early as the 1st of July, with the German Sixth Army approaching the big bend of the Don and threatening the road to the city, Stalin told Timoshenko, "I order the formation of an army group Stalingrad. The city itself will be defended by the 62nd Army to the last man."
If the Stalingrad had caved in, and the Red Army, as it planned to do, was to move westwards at high speed, it would have been able to seal off the German army group in the Caucasus, and that would have trapped an enormous number of men. So the argument is that by holding on in Stalingrad until February the 3rd, and obviously constraining a certain element of Russian forces, it enabled German troops who'd penetrated deep in the Caucasus to get out and pull back, and Manstein to build up an improvised defense line and thus more or less stabilize the position, which appeared at one stage, the whole of the German southern wing appeared to be in great jeopardy.
At the time of Stalin's order, the 62nd Army were desperately preparing a defensive position at the Klach bridgehead, west of the Don, supported to the south by the 64th Army and 1st Tank Army. On the 30th of July, the German 6th Army struck north and south of this formation, and by the 8th of August, it was encircled. The remnants of the 62nd and 64th Army pulled back to form a defensive perimeter around Stalingrad, leaving the approach road virtually undefended. On the 23rd of August, the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus and the 4th Panzer Army crossed the Don and sped towards the city. Despite the resolute defense of the outnumbered Soviet forces, the Germans crashed through the suburbs. Only a rapid withdrawal to the inner city on the 30th of August prevented a complete encirclement of the forward defences. The depleted Russian ranks were bolstered by the addition of 125,000 adult citizens and 7,000 male youths between the ages of 13 and 17. Workers in the munitions factories handed over weapons and equipment to their soldiers as soon as they came off the production lines. As the battle grew in intensity, they were forced to use them themselves. In their eagerness for a rapid victory, the Germans made a severe tactical error. While the firebombing of the Luftwaffe, which was ordered as a prelude to the final assault, created major structural damage, it also constricted the mobility of the attackers. It turned the struggle for occupation into a Rattenkrieg, a rat's war, through the rubble-choked thoroughfares of the city. German tank superiority and aerial dominance counted for very little. The German army's whole tactical training had been concerned with how to avoid such a war of vicious attrition. The defenders, on the other hand, proved adept at this hide-and-seek struggle through the labyrinth of ruined buildings and blocked alleyways to which Stalingrad was reduced. The battle zones contracted to minuscule proportions. In the larger buildings, floors and even stairways were transformed into centers of conflict. Any overview became almost impossible, as the individual buildings changed hands several times in a single day. Back in Germany, the slow progress of its army gave rise to jokes, parodying the official reports from the front. Today our troops captured a 2-roomed flat with kitchen, toilet and bathroom. They managed to retain 2/3 of it, despite hard-fought counterattacks from the enemy. Nevertheless, the sheer weight of the German attack began to tell. By mid-September, the defense of the city seemed on the point of being overwhelmed. The answer to the question, how close were the Germans to winning the Battle of Stalingrad, is a sobering one.
About 400 yards, because the final stages of the German attack in November had driven Marshal Chuikov right down to the water's edge, and he had his headquarters actually on the water's edge. They were never pushed off, but it got to the stage where the battle, which was a horrendous affair, was grinding down Russian battalion after Russian battalion, as it was with the Germans, by the way. And there was also the argument who could hang on the longest. But that, I think, was very probably between November the 24th and the last week, yes, of November, running into the first few days of December. It appeared to be touch and go.
The result of the war in the East hung once again in the balance. Hitler was disregarding the tactics of the Vernichtungsgedanke, the idea of annihilation by swift blows to the flanks and rear, which had been the basis of all German successes to date. He was disregarding the needs of the campaign in the Caucasus by diverting crucial amounts of manpower to Stalingrad. And totally out of character, he was ignoring the weaknesses of the German flanks along the 60-mile salient which the attack on Stalingrad had created. Hitler was risking everything in his growing obsession with this one city. The Red Army, pressed back against the Volga with the smoking ruins of Stalingrad in front of them, were once again on the rack. The optimism of the early spring had turned sour in a soul-destroying series of defeats which saw further huge tracts of their homeland fall into enemy hands. Should Stalingrad now capitulate, the blow to their morale would be immense. More ominously, the fall of Stalingrad would seal the fate of the Caucasus and pave the way for the final breach of the only barrier to stand between Nazi Germany and absolute control of the European continent. For all the excesses and brutalities of Stalin's Russia, its collapse would unleash an era of cold-blooded slaughter and mayhem such as the world had never before witnessed. In the words of Joseph Goebbels, a time of brutality approaches of which we ourselves have absolutely no conception. In fact, we are in the middle of it. We shall only reach our goal if we have enough courage to destroy, laughingly to shatter, what we once held holy, such as tradition, upbringing, friendship, and human love. The battle for Stalingrad was to continue unabated for another 4 agonizing months, during which time the Germans had captured 90% of the city. But with a display of heroic courage in the face of defeat, the Russians finally threw out their tormentors, and with them, Hitler's demented vision of Russian enslavement and world domination. In the autumn of 1942, only the grim resistance of the Red Army stood between Hitler and the conquest of the city which he sought above all others, Stalingrad. The terrible ferocity of the fighting in the ruined city has become a byword for savagery and tenacity. But the Germans had almost succeeded in capturing the city without street fighting.
The German Sixth Army could conceivably have won at Stalingrad, but only under one condition. That is, before or by September the 13th, 1942, they had managed to encircle outside the city of Stalingrad the two Soviet armies which subsequently defended the city, namely the 62nd Soviet Army and the 64th Soviet Army. But once that chance was missed, what happened was the two Soviet armies and the rest of Soviet defenders fell back on Stalingrad, and that was really the onset of the enormous cataclysmic battle which took place.
Despite this heroic resistance, by October, the Germans occupied 7/8 of the city. The Russian 62nd Army, under its newly appointed commander General V.I. Zhukov, was penned back against the Volga River. However, battered ferries from the Russian-held East Bank, running a gauntlet of bombs and artillery fire, kept the encircled defenders' lifeline in place. They were supplied with just enough food and munitions to continue the fighting. Nonetheless, in the third week of October, it seemed as if the Russians would finally be overrun. Only the inspirational leadership of Zhukov, rallying his forces from the thick of the action, and the Red Army's capacity to regain under cover of darkness the strong points they had lost by day, prevented the fall of the city.
The conditions in Stalingrad were unbelievably ghastly. In fact, this was a complete and utter orgy of horror. Stalingrad had been reduced to rubble by heavy German bombing. Therefore, you didn't have a front line. What you really had throughout the city, by day and by night, was constant, uninterrupted fire. Fire from the Soviet artillery, from rather heavier guns, but mostly small arms fire, and combat, really man-to-man and hand-to-hand fighting. It wasn't a question of controlling a sector of the front. It was a question of controlling the room of a house, or a partial section of a house, or a piece of a road, or a piece of a building. It's generally regarded, I think, as one of the most horrendous battles in the history of the world, both for its ferocity, also for its inhumanity, and also for these conditions which were quite unbelievably nightmarish, and got worse, of course, as the weather got colder.
To add to the inhuman demands of their fighting, nature now added her own burden. During the first half of November, the Volga was blocked by ice. Without the ferries, the Russian position became almost intolerable. There was some relief because the German Luftwaffe, hampered by snow, now flew only half the number of sorties it had managed at the outbreak of the battle. But this was still twice what the Red Air Force could achieve. Again, the German army came within a whisker of overpowering the Russian defenses. After months of bloody house-to-house fighting of unimaginable horror, a final German attack was planned for November the 18th. But it was already too late. Behind the Russian lines, preparations were already underway for a counter-offensive which would doom the Sixth Army's effort and spell the collapse of the whole German campaign in the south. As early as August, The German High Command had warned Hitler of the dangers of advancing Army Group A into the Caucasus, while simultaneously using Army Group B to attempt the capture of Stalingrad. German military resources were totally inadequate to safeguard the flanks of this double spearhead. A gap soon developed between Groups A and B, which was 200 miles wide and guarded by just a single division. Not only did Hitler ignore the warnings of his generals, which grew more raucous as the campaign developed, but he continuously weakened the flanks of the two groups by siphoning off forces to feed his ongoing obsession with capturing the city named after his deadly rival. As von Manstein wrote later, to leave the main body of the army group at Stalingrad for weeks on end was a cardinal error. It amounted to nothing less than presenting the enemy with the initiative, and it was a clear invitation for him to surround the Sixth Army. By the 19th of November, the Soviet counterattack routed the Romanian troops to the north of Stalingrad, while 100 miles to the south, the Red Army overran a mixed German and Romanian force.
The Soviet counter-offensive, which opened on the 19th of November 1942, came as a huge and catastrophic surprise to the Germans. There had been hints. They suspected that something was going on, but they didn't realize the scale of what was going to happen. And the first thing that happened was, that is to the north of the Don, to the north of Stalingrad, several Soviet armies, including a tank army, fell on the German flank. But it wasn't a German flank. It was a flank manned by Romanians, by the Romanian army. And at sight of this Russian advance hurtling upon them, the Romanians broke and fled. And that was the first northern wing of this encircling movement. Well, down to the south of Stalingrad, a second pincer movement then began, in equal strength and in equal force. So the Germans discovered actually that they were really fighting virtually on two fronts, to the north and the south.
On November the 22nd, the two Russian armies met and Stalingrad was encircled. Von Paulus, the inexperienced commander of the Sixth Army, requested that he be allowed to reform his troops and withdraw. During those first days of the encirclement, the Sixth Army had barely 6 days' rations of food and ammunition for only 2 days. Many of its artillery batteries were completely out of shells.
Hope of salvation for the German Sixth Army rested on a rapid and speedy breakout. If they'd done that, there are many arguments to suggest that they would have escaped. They would have been able to move through a fairly thinly held Russian or Soviet line of encirclement, both to the north and the south, but they didn't. The orders were quite the opposite. The orders were to stand fast, and the orders were then finally, of course, to move back into Stalingrad, which then proved to be the area and the place of their actual entombment. So once that chance was missed, then I think the situation became critical. And this can be proved by looking at the other part. When attempts were made to conduct a large-scale breakthrough operation from outside the Soviet ring, it became more and more difficult, and it became finally impossible. So unless the chance had been seized to move fast and move quickly and get out of that encirclement, to get away, then I think Sixth Army was inevitably and inescapably doomed.
On the 26th, Hitler delivered a personal message to the beleaguered troops of Stalingrad, ordering them to stand fast and promising to do all in his power to support them. The problem of supplies was turned over to the Luftwaffe, which had so valiantly supplied the pocket of Demyansk the previous spring. Goering, its commander, was summoned before Hitler and agreed to guarantee 550 tons of supplies per day. Despite the skepticism of the Army Chiefs of Staff, the airlift began on the 25th of November. The results of the first days of the operation were ominous for the troops still fighting the Rats' War among the cellars and ruins of the city. Only 65 tons were delivered on day 1. The same quantities arrived on day 2. On the third day, no supplies whatsoever reached the desperate German forces. The Luftwaffe had no safe landing grounds in the vicinity of the Sixth Army. As the German perimeter of control around the city shrank under Russian pressure, this situation consistently deteriorated. Thick fogs made flying hazardous, if not impossible. Freezing temperatures meant that aircraft servicing became a tortuous task for the German mechanics. Added to this, the Red Air Force was increasing its sorties, and the tactics of its pilots were sharpening as the conflict wore on. The airlift proved a fiasco, and the German troops began to starve. However, the airlift was only part of Hitler's strategy to relieve the situation in Stalingrad. Von Manstein was ordered to form a relief force to be known as Army Group Don. Its immediate objective was to bring the enemy attacks to a standstill and recapture the positions previously occupied. Von Manstein's strategy involved an attack by Army Group Don towards Stalingrad and a breakout westwards by part of the Sixth Army. When both assault forces met, they would provide a corridor through which the remnants of the Sixth Army still engaged in Stalingrad could be withdrawn. Von Manstein's problems began even before his forces could attack the Russians. The reinforcements, which would give Army Group Don its only hope against vastly superior Russian numbers, failed to arrive. Worse, the Russian strength in the area was increasing. The 4th Panzer Army was forced to launch the offensive alone. Against all the odds, by the 17th of December, von Manstein had reached a position only 35 miles short of Stalingrad, forcing sections of the Red Army surrounding the city to break away from the siege to block the advance. By the 19th, the relief had gained another 5 miles and was just 30 miles from making contact with 6th Army.
You can look at the Soviet-German War at that period, between 42 and 44, as a duel between Manstein and Zhukov. They were two very similar commanders. What was characteristic of them is they had an acute grasp of the strategic situation. The second thing which made them very similar, by the way, they both had to deal with very difficult masters. Manstein had Hitler and Zhukov had Stalin. And although both Manstein and Zhukov had ideas of their own, they were not always actually free. Well, take the Stalingrad situation, not entirely free to pursue the course of action which was militarily most sensible. And from that point of view, yes, there is a similarity between them. So as strategic analysts, if you like, and as strategic commanders, and of perhaps the two commanders on the Eastern Front who were capable of handling not just a division, a corps, or even an army, but groups of army. I mean, this enormous strategic command, this, I think, illustrates the nature of the commands which both of these men exercised.
Von Manstein urgently requested Hitler to allow the Sixth Army to retreat towards him and bring the Russians under fire from east and west. Once the German forces met, then the 3,000 tons of supplies assembled behind the 4th Panzer Army could be pushed through to those retreating from the city. Faced with silence from Führer headquarters, von Manstein himself gave the order for the breakout to begin. It would be a desperate gamble for the Sixth Army. Only 100 of its tanks remained operational, and these held sufficient fuel for a journey of 20 miles or less. The physical ability of von Paulus' half-starved troops to mount any sort of mobile campaign was also questionable. Faced with these risks, and in possession of previous orders from Hitler to stand firm, von Paulus disobeyed the direct order of von Manstein, his superior officer, and did not attempt to break out. In doing so, he doomed the majority of the 250,000 soldiers under his command to slow and painful death.
One of the great arguments at the time for the so-called sacrifice of Paulus's Sixth Army in Stalingrad, that in fact it was doing something very noble and very important. In other words, it was actually holding back Soviet forces so they would not be able to advance further and cut off the other German army group, which was operating in the Caucasus. In other words, it allowed the German armies which were in the Caucasus time to withdraw, time to fall back, time to escape an even bigger Soviet trap. That has a certain amount of force to it. That is perfectly true in the first part of the encirclement operation. But as time went on, and certainly by, let us say, mid-December, this argument had less and less force. First of all, because the Russians realized, from their point of view, they needed less troops to contain Stalingrad, and therefore troops are actually being released. And the second thing, the Russians were also developing plans themselves for a gigantic, a much huger encirclement operation. So in historical terms, yes, for a while, 6th Army and 4th Panzer did execute that particular role, and it was important. But as time went on, that kind of justification, if you like, for holding so many troops in this ghastly hellhole of Stalingrad lost more and more justification. And finally, it really didn't have any effect at all.
Events to the north and the south of the city now began to draw attention away from the plight of the army marooned in Stalingrad. Far more than the struggle for one city was now at stake. The issue was no longer the fate of a single army, but the entire southern wing of the front, and ultimately, of all the German armies in the east. By Christmas Eve, the Red Army was within striking distance of Rostov. Only 2 days earlier, Army Group A had begun its withdrawal from the Caucasus. Should the Russians reach Rostov before them, their retreat would be cut off. The ordinary German soldiers only gradually became aware of the magnitude of the disaster which was upon them. By the new year, the 4th Panzer Army, having abandoned the 6th Army to its fate, had withdrawn as far as Rostov. It provided the only effective barrier between the advance of Soviet forces and the capture of the city. By January the 7th, the Red Army was only 30 miles from Rostov, but remained slow to exploit its superiority. Hitler also remained slow to order a complete evacuation of the south. He waited until the 27th of January, when Army Group A seemed doomed, to finally allow its retreat through Rostov. In Stalingrad, the situation of the 6th Army had deteriorated rapidly throughout January. On the 8th, von Paulus was offered terms for a surrender by the Russians. Hitler refused to capitulate. German troops were collapsing from starvation and exhaustion. They were dying of exposure, and some were committing suicide. Even when Army Group A had been withdrawn beyond Rostov, and 6th Army's continued resistance served little strategic purpose, Hitler refused to allow them to surrender. On January the 31st, he made von Paulus a field marshal. The following day, von Paulus surrendered. He became the first field marshal since the unification of the state to fall into enemy hands.
This was the first time for 130 years that a German army had surrendered in the field. So historically speaking, it was if you like, a body blow at German prestige. The second thing was, of course, it had an enormous impact on the myth, if you like, or the image which Hitler projected of himself as being the great master planner and master strategist who had the Midas touch. He simply had to speak and everything would fall into place. I think the effect largely was more psychological, deeply psychological, than in fact it was catastrophically military in that sense, because the Germans were able to recover. But the profound sense of shock, which the surrender of an entire German army in the field for the first time affected the civilian population. It affected the high command of the German armed forces, by the way. It also affected the civilian morale at home. And it also had a profound effect on the morale of soldiers in the field. And from that point of view, the defeat at Stalingrad, I think, was most relevant and most important. And those effects, it's possible to argue, in fact, never wore off.
Announcing the disaster at Stalingrad to the rest of the forces in the east, the German High Command requested that officers in the field read out the last message received by shortwave radio from the ruins of the tractor factory Red October. We are the last survivors in this place. 4 of us are wounded. We have been entrenched in the wreckage of the tractor factory for 4 days. We have not had food for 4 days. I have just opened the last magazine for my automatic. In 10 minutes, the Bolsheviks will overrun us. Tell my father that I have done my duty, and that I shall know how to die. Long live Germany. Heil Hitler.
Stalingrad cost the Russians about 800,000 men. But what happened to the Red Army actually at Stalingrad and after Stalingrad? But Stalin gave them a big boost. He did 2 things which were very important. He kicked out the commissars, the political officers. He demoted them. And he turned the Red Army into a professional army. The second thing, he gave them lots of medals and lots of braid. They got a great deal of praise. And I think what they'd also got as well was suddenly a greater confidence in their command. People like Rokossovsky, people like Zhukov, people like Vasilievsky, people like Vatutin. I mean, these were commanders who knew their job and were able to do the job properly. And they also began to see the fact that what they were fighting with, by the way, was their own equipment. 99% of the weapons, tanks, guns, and aircraft used at Stalingrad were Soviet produced. So this sense of, I think, vindication of how they had behaved, they hadn't given up Stalingrad. This sense somehow that victory was a long, long, long way off, but it was vaguely, possibly, imperceptibly discernible. The fact that they'd crushed a German army and destroyed a German field marshal, and the fact that their own army had, as I say, a sense of increasing professionalism was really very important. And morale, of course, was sky high.
After Stalingrad, the full fury of the Russian counter-offensive was unleashed against the retreating Germans. The jubilant Russian forces now surged westward to bring the fight to the enemy. To the north of Voronezh, the Soviet attack had taken Kursk by the 7th of February. Kharkov fell on the 16th despite the orders of Hitler that it be held to the last man. A major push southwards toward the Sea of Azov and westward toward the river Dnieper threatened to completely encircle the remaining forces of Army Group Don and the section of Army Group A which had escaped from the Caucasus.
The defeat at Stalingrad was catastrophic. At the front itself, it was a question of trying to hold this defensive force together, and that was their first job. But outside, the problem was really to re-establish a stable front in the south. The threat was that with the Russians virtually on the rampage, which is what it amounted to across large areas of steppe, that the whole of the German southern wing might be unhinged, that the whole lot could just be shoved aside. And if the Russians had achieved their major strategic objective, it is quite certain that the entire southern wing, not the southern front, the southern wing of the German armies in the east would have been unhinged. But it was left to Field Marshal Manstein, who was rushed in, if you like, as the fireman by Hitler to begin to restore the situation. What he did, he very steadily built up what he intended to be a more stable and a more effective Don front. So the first job of stabilizing the southern wing, if you like, was completed. The second job was obviously to bring in reinforcements. And then the third thing was, which is very strange, but in a sense was for the Germans to think once again offensively.
The numbers with which the Russians attacked and the speed of their own advance now proved their downfall. Crippled by lack of transport, bogged down in the early thaw and short of supplies, the Soviet thrust suddenly ran out of steam only 30 miles from the Dnieper crossing. Von Manstein immediately seized this opportunity to methodically chop off the spearheads of the Russian attack and stabilize the German front. Only a month after being retaken by the Russians, Kharkov was once again in German hands. By the 19th of March, Belgorod, more than 50 miles northeast of Kharkov, was also retaken. The thaw was now in full flood, and the annual spring lull descended on the whole of the Eastern Front. For the German army, it marked the close of a disastrous winter campaign. The Caucasus had been lost, as well as a large section of the Donets Basin and the strategic Don Bend. 6th Army had been destroyed, 4 other Axis armies had been gutted, and Stalingrad now lay 500 miles to the west of the German lines. Yet, in the end, the German generals counted themselves lucky that the situation was not far worse. Once again, during the winter of 1942, the Germans had found themselves retreating, having come tantalizingly close to realizing their ambitious objectives.
It's easy to concentrate on Stalingrad, but it's also easy to forget there were other operations which were extremely important. The object of the Soviet High Command was not just the destruction of the German army in the south. The Soviet High Command was also intent in trying to destroy the German army in the center, and also they had this extreme obligation of trying to relieve the pressure on Leningrad in the north. So you've got a very complex situation, as it were, almost a series of concertina relationships. One expands, the other contracts. Yes, it did have some effect. The intensity of the fighting was concentrated certainly in the south in 1942, late 42, 1943. But it's interesting to notice that if you examine the Stalingrad operations closely from the Soviet point of view, you see the operation steadily moving northwards. They take the German 6th Army, then they move upward to the Italians, they take up the Hungarians, they're moving all the time up the front, that is in a northerly direction, and they're also expanding to the south. In other words, it was a very complex strategic picture, but much, of course, depended on the outcome of Stalingrad.
The twin failures of Stalingrad and the Caucasus were enormous psychological bombshells for German morale. The German army's belief in its own invincibility, dented by the retreat from Moscow, had now completely disintegrated. As supreme warlord, most of the blame for this lay squarely on the shoulders of Adolf Hitler. However, while the military tactics of Hitler were proving increasingly impossible for his generals to stomach, the political blunderings of the brutal and debauched administrators of occupied Russia were presenting them with a problem no less indigestible. For long stretches of the previous year, as many as 24 divisions of the German army had been diverted to attempting to suppress the growing menace of partisan sabotage. The rapid massacre of Soviet Jews, the indiscriminate torture and slaying of simple resistance, had totally backfired against the Reich Commissars of the conquered territories. In May of 1942, the first attempt was made to coordinate the disparate bands of partisans which had formed in response to the savage Untermensch policies of the German occupation. Republican and regional partisan headquarters were set up, and an official liaison between the movement and the Red Army was established for the first time. This meant that the activities of the partisans could now be directed against objectives of crucial importance to the overall military strategy. By 1943, the conditions of the Russian troops at the front had improved tremendously. The spring lull meant that soldiers who had gone for months without washing could now visit the steam baths which had been erected behind the lines. The break in the fighting gave the field's tailor shops the chance to repair damaged uniforms, sped up the delivery of the precious letters from home, and allowed the exhausted troops a much-needed period of rest and relaxation. While the conditions of the Russian soldiers continued to improve as the war went on, the lot of their German counterparts began to deteriorate. In fact, by the spring of 1943, the German army in the east was almost on the point of collapse. In March, the Eastern Front, still extending from Finland in the north to the Black Sea in the south, was almost 500,000 men short of establishment. Divisional strength had been reduced from 9 to 6 battalions, while the casualty rate among experienced officers and NCOs had been particularly high. Equipment levels were low. By February, only 500 German tanks remained serviceable, and most of these were still inferior to the Russians' T-34s. The situation in the panzer brigades became so desperate that Hitler was forced to recall General Heinz Guderian to active service. Guderian, one of the most able and audacious of the panzer leaders, had been dismissed from his command in the winter of 1941, ironically, for withdrawing forces without permission. He was now charged with the responsibility for the future development of the armoured troops along lines that will make that arm of the service into a decisive weapon for winning the war. Guderian was encouraged by the continued upswing in the production of Panzer VI Tiger tanks, 56 tons of well-armoured mobile artillery armed with a modification of the devastating 8.8 centimetre anti-aircraft gun. The Tiger boasted a top speed of 23 miles per hour on the road. Combined with the PZKW-5 Panther, the Tiger gave the Germans qualitative parity with the Russians for the first time since the beginning of the war. The Panther, weighing 45 tons, was lighter and more mobile than the Tiger, with a top speed of 34 miles per hour, while its 7.5 centimetre gun possessed considerable penetrative ability. Improved assault guns and tank destroyers were also appearing. Taking into account the upgunning of the Panzer Marks III and IV, the potential for Guderian was to supply these weapons in such quantities that their possession by experienced crews would offset Soviet numerical superiority.
The new German tanks, in which Hitler placed huge faith in the Tigers, the new Tigers and the Panther tanks, of course they were superior to the Russian tanks. That is certainly to the T-34. Even more important, of course, they were impervious to the fire of Soviet anti-tank guns. In 1943, Stalin was deeply, deeply concerned about the upgrading, the modernization, and the refitting of the Soviet tank force. And so you find from about the midsummer, the summer of 1943, the appearance on the Eastern Front of large numbers of modernized German tanks, Tigers and Panthers, self-propelled guns and so on. And from the Soviet side, the same attempt to update and improve their armor. So the Russians improved the T-34-85. The second thing, they began to develop a much heavier tank, which later became, of course, the Joseph Stalin ones, which were really very formidable heavy tanks indeed. But the problem from the Russian side was not just the tanks. The problem was that of anti-tank defenses. And they found the answer certainly increasing the number of anti-tank guns, but what they really did was to develop self-propelled guns with quite heavy calibers. And they actually were the instruments which took on the Tigers at the Battle of Kursk in 1943.
Guderian's need for time to reorganize and re-equip the panzer divisions mirrored the requirements of the German army as a whole. The idea of any immediate victory in Russia was now simply the stuff of rhetoric. Given the inability of the German army to defend its complete front, a draw could not be achieved by defensive tactics. The reverses to be imposed on the Red Army would have to be forced by a series of limited assaults. Von Manstein's counterattacks, which had prevented complete disaster during the previous winter, had impressed Hitler. He was invited to put forward a plan for the crucial summer campaign. Von Manstein presented Hitler with two offensive alternatives. The first was to prepare for a Soviet assault, which would almost certainly be launched in the Ukraine, and withdraw before it. Wheeling to the left, German forces would then mount a decisive attack on its exposed northern flank, encircling the leading spearhead of the Russian advance. The second alternative was to cut off the enormous Soviet salient, which had emerged to the north of Kharkov and to the south of Orel, a bulge extending 70 miles westwards from Kursk and measuring approximately 100 miles in width. Hitler chose the second alternative, despite the dilemma which it posed for the attacking forces. It was vital to attack before the Soviet generals got wind of the plan and could prepare defenses. It was also crucial to von Manstein that the offensive be launched before the Russians recovered from the losses incurred the previous winter. On the other hand, if the attack were to take place in mid-May, as von Manstein insisted, German manpower and equipment might not be sufficient to ensure victory.
Hitler's intention certainly was to strike the decisive blow on the Eastern Front. This was to destroy the Red Army completely, to destroy its armored forces, to break through, to take Moscow, and this was to be the final decisive blow on the Eastern Front. In terms of the force that the Germans assembled, in terms of their armored troops, in terms of their battle-tested, thoroughly professionalized, very capable divisions, if you look at it in terms of military statistics, then the chances were very much, I would have said, in favor of the German army. It had done it before, it could do it again. But this is not to say, of course, that that's the way the operation itself went. But in terms of the command, in terms of the competence, in terms of the armor, in terms of the experience, and indeed very possibly in terms of the German estimate of Russian capabilities in defensive actions. And remember, the Russians had never fought a major defensive action on the Eastern Front at all. Then the chances, I suppose, were reasonable, bordering perhaps on a gamble.
Guderian was against the operation from the start, arguing that the new Panther and Tiger tanks must be held back until they were available in sufficient quantities to ensure a decisive success. Hitler postponed the date of the attack until July, in the hope that by then the number of new tanks would tip the balance of firepower in Germany's favor. By now, Russian Air Force reconnaissance had improved to the point where Stalin's awareness of German dispositions was comprehensive and generally accurate. He had also managed to infiltrate German headquarters and was supplied with additional intelligence by his spy ring in Switzerland, codenamed Lucy, which had many high-level contacts inside Germany. Stalin's knowledge of German preparations was so precise, he even knew the date chosen by Hitler for the launch of Operation Citadel.
Kursk is a salient. It's very large, and it was a large arrow, really, sticking right into the German center. You had the northern face and the southern face, and across it you had the town of Kursk, of course, at the center of this. And the Russians, the Soviet command, for the first time decided to fight a major, sustained, deliberate defensive battle. They had never done this before. Stalin had no confidence in the Red Army fighting defensively. He always wanted the Red Army to fight offensively and offensively and offensively. No matter what the casualties were, what the losses were, the Red Army must always attack. And even on the eve of Kursk, he was tempted to try a preemptive Soviet first strike, as it were, and was dissuaded from this, partly by Zhukov and partly by others who said, look, let us now proceed with the defensive measures we have put in train.
Stalin, advised by Zhukov, prepared patiently and thoroughly for the German advance. The Soviet lines consisted of 6 belts of defenders composed of anti-tank posts, thick minefields, and 3,000 miles of trenches supported by 3,000 tanks and 20,000 guns.
The general Soviet system was this. They had really 3 lines of defenses. There was the first line, of course, which was really to break up the German attack. The second line, which hopefully would in fact enable them to bring their anti-tank defenses to bear. And the last line, of course, was really this was where the battle or the engagements would be conducted, and you would break up and generally deflect the German attack as such. And this went all the way down from corps level, indeed from army down to corps, down to division, down to regiment, to battalion. Each had its own defensive sectors. So it really was a colossal undertaking on a scale, I think, which really taxes the imagination.
With every passing moment, the successful outcome of the Kursk offensive grew more necessary for Hitler. German morale, depleted by the failures at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus, was now further undermined by defeat in West Africa. Hitler's inability to adequately supply Rommel with men and materials led to disaster at Medellin in March, and the eventual collapse of the Axis African forces in May. By June, southern Europe lay totally exposed to the threat of Allied attack. In Britain, the RAF and the American Air Force prepared to launch massive bombing raids against German industrial and civilian targets as a prelude to invasion from the west. Hitler not only needed a victory at Kursk, he needed victory on a scale which would allow him the breathing space to fend off the enemies which were beginning to close around him. Anything less would prove a catastrophe. On the Russian side, for the first time, the Red Army would be prepared for a major German offensive. It was determined to make the most of its advantage. On July the 5th, 1943, as von Manstein and von Kluge approached the Kursk salient in a classic pincer movement involving 1 million men and 2,700 tanks, the death ride of the panzers was about to commence.
Hitler intended that Operation Citadel, the great attack on the Kursk salient in 1943, would be the decisive blow. He'd argued in 1941 that the Red Army was destroyed, which it wasn't. He argued again in 1942 that the Red Army was destroyed, which it wasn't, by the way. Here in 1943, Hitler was determined to deliver the coup de grace. This is what it was to be. It was to be the largest armored operations in world history, a gigantic assembly of tanks and guns and aircraft and assault troops. And Hitler had placed enormous hopes upon it. It was, I think, meant to be a war-winning blow. It was meant to correct, if you like, the lingering impression of Stalingrad. It was to wipe that out. It was to afford the Germans something which was extremely important, which is to say it was intended to ensure that the German army retained the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. This, under no circumstances, must pass to the Russians.
Adolf Hitler was fully aware of the absolute necessity of success at Kursk. But when the roaring waves of German armor crashed into the salient in July 1943, the attack which the German army was about to unleash was already doomed to fail. The essence of von Manstein's strategy for the battle had been to exploit the mobility and tactical superiority of the German panzer units. Instead, the German tanks drove confidently towards a grinding war of attrition, where the advantage lay squarely with the defenders. The effectiveness of a Russian defense limited the progress of von Kluge's 9th Army to an advance of some 6 miles. It was then ground to a halt by Rokossovsky's central front to the north of the Kursk salient. In the south, von Manstein's 4th Panzer Army advanced 25 miles by the 10th of July and threatened to penetrate the Voronezh front under Marshal Vatutin. Reserves from the steppes front had to be pumped into the battle to bolster the salient's defenders and prevent the 4th Panzer from breaking through into open country. The Germans had fallen into Zhukov's cunningly prepared trap. As Guderian acknowledged, by the failure of Citadel, we had suffered a decisive defeat. The armoured formations, reformed and re-equipped with much effort, had lost heavily in both manpower and equipment, and would now be unemployable for a long time to come. There was the real prospect that they would never be rehabilitated in time to defend the Eastern Front. From now on, the Russians were in undisputed possession of the initiative.
In the Battle of Kursk, although it's a ghastly affair, what really staggered the German commander was the speed with which the Russians moved from the defensive to the counteroffensive, on a very large scale, by the way. It was only a matter of about 4 days after the German defeat that Konyev's reserve step front was changed and was moving into action. So from every point of view, from defensive preparation to the actual conduct of the battle, and indeed the subsequent move to the counteroffensive, was really quite an astonishing undertaking.
Adolf Hitler was fully aware of the absolute necessity of success at the Battle of Kursk. He needed a success to re-establish the month lost in the disaster at Stalingrad. It was a gamble which was not destined to succeed. In the north, the effectiveness of a Russian defense limited the progress of von Klunger's 9th Army. In the south, von Manstein's 4th Panzer Army advanced 25 miles and threatened to penetrate the Voronezh front. Reserves from the steppes front had to be pumped into the battle to bolster the salient's defenders and prevent the 4th Panzers from breaking through into open country. They succeeded, and the Germans had fallen into Zhukov's trap. From now on, the enemy was in undisputed possession of the initiative. Having enticed the Germans into total but disastrous commitment to their armored forces, the Red Army swiftly exploited their advantage. Even while the gargantuan tank struggle was still being bitterly contested, on the 12th of July, the Russians counterattacked towards Orel, which was itself a salient in German hands. The respectable army group center, reinforced by units from the 4th Panzer Army, which had broken off its attack on Kursk, attempted to check the advance.
German Army Group Center was the implacable enemy of the Red Army. It had been its most implacable enemy since 1941, and it was still its most implacable enemy in 1944. Numerous attempts had been made by the Red Army and the High Command to destroy Army Group Center, and they couldn't. They tried and tried. Army Group Center held fast, absolutely and completely. Even at Stalingrad, by the way, very little is known about this. While Zhukov was actually organizing the counterattack at Stalingrad, he was also, by the way, on the 25th of November 1942, organizing an attack against Army Group Center. He was not distracted by Stalingrad, but he understood, as every Soviet commander did, that the enemy was Army Group Center, stationed right in the center of the Soviet-German front. Not only was it strategically important, it covered lines of communication, it covered important population centers, and above all, actually, it covered one thing the Russians desired above all, the shortest route to Germany and to Berlin. You couldn't go, well, you could go around, you could go down to, but really the only way was to blast their way through and get on to the highway to Berlin. So Army Group Center was as an object of vital strategic importance for the Soviet High Command.
But by now, the Eastern Front was not the only theatre of disaster for the German armies. On the 10th of July, Allied forces had invaded Sicily. By the 25th, Mussolini had been arrested and a provisional government set up in Italy. Fearing the defection of his Mediterranean ally, Hitler desperately needed to make troops available for the defense of the peninsula. On August the 1st, he ordered an immediate withdrawal from the Oral salient. By the 5th of August, the provincial capitals of Oral and Belgorod had been liberated. Near Belgorod, the Germans attempted a counterattack with 60,000 troops and 18,000 Hitler Youth, who arrived at the front carrying flags with the ironic inscription, "The world belongs to us." The frenzied German counterstroke succeeded in pushing back the Red Army, but the Russian tide of resurgence was irresistible. After clawing their way forward for 10 days, the German advance was again flung backward towards the Dnieper. The Great Retreat was about to begin. The all-conquering German army, which had disdainfully swept aside the Russian border defences only 2 years previously, was now struggling to maintain a presence in the field of battle. The panzer units, which had sliced the Red Army to pieces in a series of dazzling pincer movements, now flung themselves headlong at the Russians in the desperate hope of slowing their progress. For the ordinary German soldiers, the notion of victory ceased to have meaning. The survival of themselves and their immediate comrades became the central concern of their lives.
The situation in 1944 for the German army in the east looked catastrophic and was catastrophic. They had lost Army Group Center. Army Group North was breaking up very rapidly. Army Group South was desperately trying to hold onto the remnants of Soviet territory in Ukraine. So it appeared that the German army was on the run, and in some respects that was true. The losses were very considerable. They had lost many, many hundreds of thousands of men. Their losses in armor were considerable. And I suppose, speaking objectively, one should argue that, yes, this was the end of the line, but it wasn't. First of all, the German commanders, as opposed to Hitler, decided that one way in which they had a fighting chance, more than a fighting chance, would be to adopt an elastic mobile defense. In other words, not take all these Russian blows on the chin directly, but move back. Then there was a reasonable chance that the German army in the east would, A, be able to survive, and even more important, what it would be able to do would in fact to be able to establish, if you like, some form of coherent defensive line, certainly further to the west, but against which very possibly the Red Army would throw itself and finally exhaust itself. The problem was that Hitler kept giving the opposite orders.
On the Russian side, the liberation of the cities and towns was proving a bittersweet experience. In Orel, the Soviet troops arrived to find half the town and all its bridges destroyed by the retreating Germans. Of the pre-war population of 114,000, only 30,000 haggard souls survived to greet their saviors. 25,000 had been sent as slaves to the labor camps of the Reich. 12,000 had been murdered by their German overlords, and thousands had died from disease and starvation. As the German forces began to move back, the partisan movement really exploded into life. Partisans taught demolition procedures, wireless operating, intelligence gathering, and how to forge and amend official German documentation.
Soviet partisans really consisted of three elements. One, there was a well-organized but very small-scale organized underground movement. Key members of the Communist Party were assigned to stay behind and build up resistance groups, but that was very specialized. The second group were civilians who were forced out by German terrorist action. Their homes were burned, blown up, relatives shot, people killed, slave labor was portending, who took to their heels and hid as best they could and would perhaps organize. The third part, of course, was, as I've said earlier, that the German army surrounded very large numbers of Red Army troops in 1941. You had encirclements of 300,000 men. Not all of these men were taken prisoner and gradually broke up, hid, were able to establish themselves as, if you like, small independent combat units, and would either get in touch with the local population to see what could be done, or in fact a form of partisan organization was built up, very primitive, but nonetheless in existence. But gradually, by 1944, the Soviet partisan movement had become very substantially organized and emplaced and was conducting its operations more or less in coordination with the Red Army. That was certainly the case as the Red Army crossed the Soviet frontiers and then had to make use of, certainly of partisans, yes, for scouting, for intelligence, for support. So the partisan movement passed through those several stages, and by 1944 had become, I would say, it was an established, a very considerable feature of the Soviet war machine.
Besides the damage they inflicted on German troops and their morale, the partisans offered hope and example to those still in the midst of Nazi tyranny. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, an 18-year-old member of the Moscow Komsomol, was caught setting fire to German stables in the village of Pestrievo. Although tortured, she revealed nothing about her comrades to the German interrogators. As she was led to the gallows with a placard around her neck describing her crime, she turned to her German captors and proclaimed defiantly, "You can't hang all 190 million of us." The story of Zoya was circulated widely, and she became a national heroine. Zoya grew to be a symbol not only of partisan resistance, but the defiance of Russian womanhood in the face of the most terrible adversity. The necessities of the war in the East smashed through most of the remaining barriers to women's contribution to the Soviet war effort. Despite the suffering which the German invasion had brought about, the people of the Soviet Union had taken everything that the Germans could throw at them, and the nation had held. By now, the majority of the population were willing cogs in a gigantic war machine. Civilians and soldiers alike seemed to grasp a new awareness of their role in the bitter conflict which raged all around them. The mood of the retreating Germans was one of intense frustration and manic desperation. Each man knowing he was staring death in the face. Their fury at certain death was unleashed towards civilians and soldiers alike. The Germans had been decisively defeated, but the war in the East was far from over. Even though a strategic withdrawal to the river Dnieper seemed the only possible option for the ragged German formations, Hitler initially stuck to his policy of holding territory to the last man. Von Tippelskirch, one of the German generals in the East, summed up the helpless rage of the field commanders forced to sacrifice men and material to a principle of no withdrawal, which had now been elevated to a moral necessity. A series of withdrawals by adequately large steps would have worn down the Russian strength, besides creating opportunities for counterstrokes when the German forces were numerous enough to make them effective. The root cause of the German defeat was the way her forces were wasted in fruitless efforts and, above all, fruitless resistance at the wrong time and place. By the 23rd of August, Kharkov was once again in Russian hands. By the 30th, Taganrog had fallen. The capture of Donbass was followed by Novorossiysk, and by the 25th of September, Smolensk had also been retaken. The waters of the Dnieper represented the only possibility of regrouping the decimated German divisions. For the pursuing Red Army, the liberation of the towns and villages east of the Dnieper continued to fill the hearts of its soldiers with a succession of contrasting emotions. The scenes of devastation and cruelty on a scale never even considered before, pits full of dead children, and the starved remains of whole families could only make their determination to totally crush their opposition complete. Even in retreat, the elite units of the German army, such as the Großdeutschland Division, managed to maintain something of their reputations by mounting a ferocious defense of the German rear. But the Dnieper was not to prove the refuge the battered German troops had been promised. Even as their defensive perimeter finally withdrew to the river's edge, they found the Russians already established there. Goaded onward by their commanders, by the atrocities they had witnessed, and the prospect of sweeping the enemy from the motherland, the Russians dispatched the German rear guard and immediately prepared to continue their pursuit. Between the 22nd and 30th of September, the Russians had forced numerous crossings of the 300-mile stretch of the river between the Pripyat marshes and Zaporozhye. Further south, by the 23rd of October, Zaporozhye and Melitop were taken by the Russians, and the 17th Army was isolated in the Crimea, reducing the dwindling strength of their eastern forces by a further 250,000. To the north, Kiev fell on the 6th of November, threatening the northern flank of Army Group South's defense of the Dnieper Bend. This Soviet pressure continued throughout November and December. Despite von Manstein's pleas to abandon what was now a vulnerable salient, Hitler remained adamant that the Dnieper Bend was to be held at all costs. By the new year of 1944, the line of German resistance from the Baltic to the Black Sea had either collapsed or was suffering such Russian pressure as to make it untenable. In Italy, the Allies had landed on September the 3rd and were battling their way up the peninsula. Back in Germany, the Reich was being subjected to destruction from the air on a scale never before experienced by any nation of war. In the first major blow against Hamburg, 30,000 people perished in a series of raids which left many more scarred and burned. The noose around Germany was tightening rapidly, and the new year on the Eastern Front offered no relief from the process of strangulation. By January the 2nd, the Russians had advanced north of Kiev and were now just 18 miles from the Polish border. On the 14th of January, the offensive which came to be known as the liberation of Leningrad was launched. Soviet forces smashed through the German defensive positions around the city, clearing the territory southwards as far as Novgorod. On the 17th of January, the besieged city was finally liberated. Leningrad had endured 900 days of isolation and unbelievable hardship. 1 million people had died.
From the point of view of the Leningraders, the lifting of the siege of Leningrad could not really have come a day too soon. Remember, it was 900 days of starvation, bombardment, hunger, death, privation, even now, as the Russians admit, days of cannibalism. So rations were down to very little. There was malnutrition, fortunately, there was very little disease. I think many people explain that thanks to the climate. It was very cold. But nonetheless, this was a city which had really suffered so dreadfully and appallingly. People were falling dead at their desks or at their workshops or at their places of work. There was a problem with children. Although many civilians had been evacuated, including civilians, there was still a large urban population. So the lifting of the siege of Leningrad is also very important militarily, because really what the Soviet command wanted to do, and it was crucial to the Soviet command, was to break the power of Army Group North, which in fact that was the German Army Group holding Leningrad, and indeed the western approaches of the Soviet Union and the Baltic states. So releasing Leningrad and then once again striking into the rear of Army Group North did two things. Yes, it liberated Leningrad. It gave the Russians an important psychological boost, but even more important, it pushed this army group away. And again, it gave the Soviet command access to the Baltic states, which was yet another route into the west, which was obviously the main direction of their strategic strike.
On the 4th of March, the northern flank of von Manstein's Army Group South was pierced by the 1st Ukrainian front under direct command of Marshal Zhukov. By the 7th, after advancing 100 miles, the Russians were astride the Warsaw-Odessa railway line, and by the 28th, Nikolaev on the Bug had been captured. Further south, the river Dniester was crossed, and Kherson, at the mouth of the Dnieper, overrun. By April, the Red Army's overstretched supply lines and the spring floods dictated an end to what was now being named the Mud Offensive. In the Crimea, however, the Russians continued to attack, and Sevastopol was taken on the 19th of May, bringing the northern shore of the Black Sea into Soviet hands once more. While the Russians were threatening the southern sector of the Eastern Front with collapse, events were unfolding off the south coast of England, which would completely alter the complexion of the war in the East. The long-awaited Second Front was about to be created. Until now, the Allied practical support had been limited to sending vehicles to support the Russians.
What happened was Great Britain and the United States sent the Soviet Union during the war about 22,000 aircraft and about 12,000 tanks. Well, when you consider the fact that the Russians produced 106,000 tanks during the war, then therefore our tank supplies were roughly somewhere about 10%. Though they were used actually, but I think the Russians found the tanks not very much use. I mean, they weren't like the T-34. They weren't fitted for operational conditions of the Eastern Front. But clearly the important thing from the Lend-Lease point of view was the 400,000 vehicles that we delivered to the Red Army. It made the Red Army mobile. Jeeps, Studebakers, the whole panoply of motor transport. That gave the Red Army a degree of mobility, which was extremely important. Certainly, once the Red Army started to move westwards, that is after, or slightly before, but certainly after the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army was not only an army of tank armies, it was also, from that point of view, a highly mobile army.
Now, in addition to supporting the Russians with supplies, the Allies were about to make a real contribution in the field. A fleet of over 5,000 vessels had been gathered together for the invasion of France. 1,200 naval vessels were on hand to sweep for mines, bombarded the German coastal defences, and protect the invaders from airborne and naval assault. 4,000 ships, barges, tugs, and amphibious craft were available for the transportation of the 2 million men and their weapons, which were to be landed on the northern coast of France over a 2-month period. 2 Mulberry harbours, as large as medium-sized ports, were to be towed across the channel in sections and constructed close to the French shore. In the air, 7,500 aircraft were mustered for the direct support of the invasion. In the early hours of the morning of the 6th of June, the first Allied paratroopers were dropped behind the targeted beaches. At dawn, 5 landing parties approached these beaches from the sea. By the first week in July, 1 million Allied soldiers had been landed. While the attention of the world focused on the D-Day landing and its aftermath, the Red Army launched a fresh offensive against Army Group Center in Barbarossa.
Stalin actually opened that attack on June the 22nd, 1944, which was the anniversary of the German invasion of Russia, by the way. The point was not lost on lots of soldiers and many civilians. So Army Group Center, say, was a formidable mass of infantry and of armored concentrations. Its extent was also very considerable. It covered both in the north and moving down to the south. As I say, it covered the key areas which the Russians wanted both for access and also for movement. And therefore it simply had to be destroyed. And this involved actually a Russian plan which was really quite complex. It meant, first of all, conducting what you might call a limited encirclement. First of all, to encircle the nearest German armies and then break them up. And the next stage was quite different, and that happened round about, well, it only took them about 10 days to do this, even less perhaps, and then to move out with mobile columns at high speed to conduct an even larger encirclement. And what the Russians did actually towards the end of June 1944 was to repeat, almost in the same place, the gigantic encirclement of German soldiers, which the German army had done to the Red Army in June and July of 1941.
The destruction of Army Group Center moved at lightning speed. Most of the 3rd Panzer Army was destroyed within a few days. At the beginning of July 1944, 100,000 German troops were encircled at Minsk. Within the week, Army Group Center had been effectively destroyed. An incision 250 miles wide had been sliced in the German front, and German casualties were estimated at 300,000. The Russian army now had a clear pathway to East Prussia and the Baltic. The failure of the Germans to deal with the summer offensive was emerging as a disaster on such a scale that even the debacle of Stalingrad paled in comparison. The war correspondent Alexander Wert reported from the Russian capital. In Moscow today, all hearts are filled with joy. The new places now being captured by the Russians are in distant Lithuania or in western Barbarossa. Division after division has been encircled and wiped out, hundreds of thousands killed, and about 100,000 taken prisoner. The score of generals captured is about 25. Of these, 100,000 or so prisoners, 57,000 were paraded throughout the streets of Moscow with their generals at their head. The Germans had finally arrived in Moscow. When the parade was over, Russian sanitation trucks disinfected the streets. By the middle of July, the Germans had been swept from Barbarossa and the Russians held much of northeast Poland. As they drove northwards into Lithuania, Army Group North was threatened with encirclement.
Army Group North was a very formidable force. It contained veteran, battle-tested soldiers who were an extremely hard nut to crack. And the fighting in the north, even after the liberation of Leningrad, was very severe and very intensive. And the Red Army made relatively slow progress coming up against opposition like that. It did finally begin to break into the Baltic states, bit by bit. But that fighting went on largely until about March 1945, which shows you the nature of that resistance and the very considerable importance of that corridor which led westwards and northwestwards.
South of the Pripyat Marsh, the Russians were making faster progress. Army Group North Ukraine were flung back beyond Lvov and Lublin. By the end of the month, units of the Red Army had reached the Vistula and were attacking the Warsaw suburbs. On the 1st of August, the Polish Home Army Command in London, anxious that the Polish capital should not fall into the hands of the advancing Soviets, ordered the Warsaw partisans to rise against their Nazi oppressors. It was to prove a tragic mistake. The 20,000 insurgents held only enough ammunition for 7 days' fighting. By the end of the battle, after 2 months of bitter struggle, 9/10 of the city had been destroyed, 200,000 people had been massacred, and the rest deported to extermination camps. The SS had organized an orgy of savagery, sousing people with petrol and setting them alight, gassing them in the sewers, and subjecting them to a nightmare regime of torture and out-of-hand execution. During this period, the Red Army remained on the outskirts of the city. Stalin was accused of standing by while this barbarous campaign of reprisal wiped out any opposition to Russian domination of Poland. On the 20th of August, the Soviet army unexpectedly launched a huge offensive against Romania, which was a major issue for Hitler.
Hitler was obsessed with the southern flank. He maintained that if it was at all possible to destroy Soviet access to the oil fields, if it was possible, if you like, to cut the lifeline of the Soviet Republic, then in fact the war would come quickly to an end. He was intent, he said actually, that one of his main objectives was to seize the oil of the Caucasus. And even in 1940, that is long before the German invasion of Russia, Hitler had taken great care to send a very powerful German military mission to Romania and to make absolutely sure that the Romanian oil fields were heavily protected. So his concern, if you like, for the economic potential of southeastern Europe, which obviously involved Romania, was very important. And it had a political importance as well. This was to show, for example, that this wasn't just a German invasion of the Soviet Union. It was, in fact, the Axis in action. And if you look at the composition of the forces which invaded the Soviet Union, they included Italians, they included Slovaks, they included, there was a Spanish element as well later on. There were Romanians, there were Hungarians. So from that point of view, it was, I think, if you like, in Hitler's terms, a kind of multinational political and military crusade which he was both organizing and which he was intending to commit in what was his own crusade for the elimination of what he called Jewish Bolshevism.
By the 23rd, 20 divisions of the German 6th Army had been encircled in a giant pocket between the rivers Dniester and Prut, an action which was admired by the eminent military historian Ziemke, who noted, "In executing their breakthroughs, the Russians showed an elegance in their tactical conceptions, economy of force and control that did not fall short of the Germans' own performance in the early war years." The effect of these reverses on Hitler was catastrophic. Increasingly, he retreated into a semi-fantasy world, which did not correspond to the realities of the battlefield. It seemed that he hoped to hide from the public eye until he could once again force events to conform to the pattern he had enjoyed until 1942. So he continued to hide himself away in his headquarters, embarrassed to face up to the hollowness of his boasts. Hitler's ostensible reason for shutting himself away was the demands made on him by the war. In reality, he was hiding from the humiliating pattern of failure. The commanders in the East, nevertheless, had to deal with the orders of this shambling reclusive, who was now a pathetic shadow of the decisive, intuitive and supremely arrogant leader who had launched Operation Barbarossa. Stalin sent the Red Army of Liberation northwards. And by the 31st of August, Bucharest had been entered. An essentially communist government was formed, and Romania was compelled to ratify its 1940 loss of territory to Russia. It was also forced to pay the Soviet Union a financial indemnity and use its army to fight against its erstwhile allies. The Red Army had advanced 250 miles in 12 days. In the next 6 days, it dashed a further 200 miles to the Yugoslav border at Turnu Severin. From here, the Soviets launched a giant flanking maneuver against the Axis defenders of Hungary. By the 24th of September, the southeast salient of Hungary had been removed, and the Russians had advanced to within 100 miles of Budapest.
From a strategic point of view, the whole of that southeastern area was of great importance. And its importance was no more dramatically demonstrated than in the summer of 1944, when Romania defected from the Axis alliance, from the German alliance. And what happened then was the whole of not the southern wing, but the southern front began to cave in. In other words, Hungary and Romania were, in many respects, a strategic buttress, if you like, or a strategic glacis, which were very important to Hitler. And signs of disaffection after the defeat of and destruction of the Romanian armies at Stalingrad, or the Hungarian armies, signs of disaffection in southeastern Europe, I think were more than slightly alarming to Hitler. I mean, the realization that, if you like, the structure of his alliance and the nature of his military organization, that is in strategic terms, was beginning to crumble.
Further south, the Yugoslav capital, Belgrade, was liberated with the aid of the Yugoslavian resistance under Tito. Bulgaria, until now at war only with Britain and the United States, was pressurized by Germany into declaring war on the USSR as well. 4 days after this declaration of the 5th of September, the Bulgarians surrendered. Further west, Slovakia, formerly a co-belligerent of Germany, had been in a state of upheaval since the previous year. A general uprising began in the second half of 1944, but a Russian advance, which began in September, was held up in the Carpathians by stiff German resistance and failed to reach Slovakia before the middle of October. By then, the 65,000-strong uprising had been quelled. The, by now, sickeningly familiar results of Nazi barbarity greeted Russian liberators, and more than 200 mass graves had been filled with slaughtered Slovaks. In the north, an armistice was concluded with Finland, and the Germans driven back into Norway before climatic conditions put an end to the fighting there. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were overrun, and the German Army Group North isolated in the Courland Peninsula. By January 1945, with all German troops finally driven from the holy soil of Mother Russia, and Stalin in control of the Balkans and the Baltic states, the Red Army prepared for its final drive towards the Reich. Between June and November, the German army in the east had suffered over 1 million casualties, 214,000 killed, and 629,000 missing in action. Another approximately 600,000 men had been seriously wounded. 1944 had proved Germany's most disastrous year of the war in the East. 106 divisions had been destroyed, 3 more than the total number mobilized in September 1939. German intelligence estimated that in the assault on the Reich, the Red Army would possess a superiority of 11-1 in infantry, 7-1 in tanks, and 20-1 in guns. Hitler dismissed such estimates as bluff. On the 12th of January, the Soviets launched their expected offensive from the Vistula against the German Central Front. The 70 divisions of Army Group Center and Army Group A were pierced over an area of 200 miles, and almost 200 divisions of the Red Army poured through the breach. By the end of the month, Soviet forces reached the lower reaches of the River Oder and were now only 40 miles from Berlin. The remnants of Army Group Center had been encircled in East Prussia. Falling back on the ancient city of Königsburg, they pathetically attempted to carry out Hitler's order to defend the region to a man. The Soviet tide was finally halted on the line of the River Oder and Neisse in February. But the limited German counterstroke was merely postponing the inevitable. A fresh Russian offensive in Hungary progressed to the borders of Austria by April the 1st, and 6 days later, the outskirts of Vienna were coming under Soviet fire.
Hitler was not a German, he was an Austrian. And this, if one looks at his attitudes and his predilections, his commitments, and, if you like, his emotional drive, it is towards, all right, southeastern Europe, to Hungary, Romania, and other areas. If you like, it's some kind of reflection, it's almost the shadow of the Habsburg Empire, which was, of course, crucially strategically important. It was politically important, it was economically important, but also I think it had for Hitler this emotional attraction, this sense that if this entity or these entities broke up, if the Bolshevik hordes broke into this area, then indeed this was the final cataclysm and this spelled actual doom.
To the north, on April the 16th, the final thrust towards Berlin was begun. On the first day of the assault alone, 42,000 artillery pieces and mortars fired 2,450 freight car loads of shells towards the German lines. Zhukov, excited at the prospect of being the first Soviet commander to reach Berlin, opened the attack, lighting the battlefield with searchlights to blind the enemy. Having retreated to the capital, Hitler alternated between vitriolic outbursts about betrayal and demonic delight in the Holocaust which was descending on Germany. In the words of Albert Speer, he deliberately attempted to make everything perish with him. Army, state and economic leaders tried to mediate Hitler's destructiveness with varying degrees of success. By the 22nd of April, with Russian troops now fighting on the streets of the German capital, the insanity was about to end. But the street warfare in Berlin was bitter. The threat of a Bolshevik invasion had been hyped by the Nazi propaganda machine as the end of Germany and the German people. Even in the last chaotic days of the Reich, there was a common joke. Enjoy the war while you can. The peace will be terrible. On the night of the 28th of April, with the Russian forces grinding ever closer to his headquarters, Hitler married his mistress, Eva Braun. After the wedding meal, he retired to write his last will and testament. He defiantly reaffirmed his belief in Lebensraum and indulged in one vitriolic attack on the Jewish race. On the afternoon of the 30th of April, having made his farewells, he poisoned his wife and his dog and shot himself. The Hitler's bodies were burned on a petrol-soaked pyre, to be joined the following night by Dr. and Frau Goebbels and their 6 children, which they had poisoned. On the same evening that Hitler, Sergeants Yagorov and Kantaria planted the victory banner of the Soviet flag on the Reichstag at 22:50 hours. It symbolized the triumph of the Soviet Union over Nazi Germany. But the cost had been horrendous. By the 8th of May, when the German Act of Surrender was ratified at Russian headquarters in Berlin, 28 million Russians, 1 in 7 of the population, had died as a direct result of the war. They had died as soldiers, partisans, prisoners of war, slaves, or innocent civilians. They had met their end through bombs, bullets, hunger, torture, burning, and exposure. Less than 5% of the young people aged between 17 and 21 had survived. For each of the 1,418 days of the war, almost 19,000 Russian people had perished. The German invaders destroyed or burnt 1,700 towns and more than 70,000 villages and hamlets, decommissioned 60% of the steelworks and 60% of the coal mines, destroyed 65,000 kilometers of railway lines and 4,100 stations, 36,000 communication centers, and tens of thousands of state farms. They looted and demolished 40,000 medical establishments, 84,000 schools and 43,000 public libraries. 25 million people had been left homeless. But in the end, the Germans had been defeated. Throughout Western Europe, Germans from the SS, the army and the civilian administration were put on trial for offences committed during the Nazi occupation. However, the number punished and the severity of their sentences was astonishingly limited given the massive scale of the crimes against humanity which had occurred. Even though the Russian government had the right to hold its own trials under Article 10 of the Four-Power Ordinance, none took place. Stalin was far more concerned about taking vengeance on traitors to the Soviet Union. Some 250,000 prisoners of war, now in Allied hands, were Soviet citizens who had been captured in German uniform. Under agreements affirmed at the Yalta Conference in 1945, those accused of treason or desertion were to be returned to their native countries for judgment. Those who had fought for the Germans were now forcibly repatriated. Some took the only escape route open to them and committed suicide. The Soviet authorities regarded these traitors as human scum and treated them with a barbarity which reflected their hatred. Another 2.25 million Russian prisoners of war had been captured during the occupation or had surrendered on the fields of battle. Tragically, Russian administrators seemed to view their very survival as an act of treachery. Many who had lived through years of gruesome warfare and the savage, inhuman degradation of the German work camps were now to spend the remainder of their time in the penal colonies of their own motherland. Inside Russia, the pre-war status quo was rapidly re-established and strengthened. The cult of Stalin as a personalization of victory ensured that his position as dictator of an authoritarian, centralized society was unassailable. The reforms and liberalizations which had occurred during the organized chaos of the war years were gradually retracted. Religious toleration, a greater modicum of democratic involvement in civilian administration, and the virtues of individual and collective initiative became incompatible with the need for the entrenched elite to control all aspects of social development. But none of this should detract from the awesome achievement of the Soviet people. Through their bravery, their labor, and their sacrifice, they managed to halt and eventually crush a seemingly invincible war machine which, with chilling efficiency, had conquered almost the entire Western European continent in a matter of months. They annihilated a German army which had unleashed in its wake a regime of apocalyptic terror, a tyranny which had turned vast tracts of Europe into a surreal playground of sadists and perverts. The victory of the Soviet people may not have ensured an era of justice and democratic ideals, but rid the world of the cancerous malignancy of National Socialism, which had for long periods threatened to engulf it.